Subscribe to Audiobook Folate.
By R.P. Jones. Jazz. Jazz emerged as a recognizable music at the end of the 19th century. Although it was first played by American Negroes, it grew out of a fusion of African and European musical forms that started long before 1900. This chapter is about the beginning of this fusion, the prehistory of jazz. The raw materials of jazz, African. As early as the 16th century, slaves from West Africa were being shipped across the Atlantic to the New World. By the end of the 18th century, an average of 70,000 slaves were taken every year to various parts of America to be sold to English, French, and Spanish owners. Very little of the African way of life survived in America, except certain religious practices, including the vaudou, or voodoo, ceremonies and ritual music. West African music was polyrhythmic, which means that 2 or more, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 rhythms, are being played at the same time. The musicians played drums, rattles, and gongs while the dancers sang, clapped, and stamped their feet. A common foundation for this music was a combination of 3/4, 4/4, and 6/8 rhythms. It is rather as though a dance band tried to play the same tune as a waltz, a foxtrot, and a march, all at the same time. The dancing, singing, clapping, and stamping made the rhythms even more complicated. The call and response brought over by the slaves occurred throughout the whole of jazz. The preacher or leader sang one line and the congregation answered him.
In the valley, couldn't hear nobody pray. On my knees, I couldn't hear nobody pray. With my burden.
The spiritual "I couldn't hear nobody pray" is a simple example of the call and response pattern. The words were not very important, but the rhythmic phrasing of both call and response varied endlessly. Because the slaves had no written music, they played and sang by memory or by ear. As the singing became more exciting, the congregation would improvise new melodies as well as new rhythms, and with several people singing different melodies at the same time, the music would become polyphonic. The slaves also brought with them their own way of singing. The field cry, or holler, was used as a greeting or simply as an expression of loneliness. It sounded something like a yodel, half yelled and half sung. Records of hollers showed the characteristics of the African voice: a warm vibrato, changes of pitch, a sliding from note to note, and an upward break in the voice. The holler exists in the work song, the spiritual, and the blues, and the timbres and inflections of the African voice have colored the use of every instrument used in jazz. These African musical patterns survived in the southern states of North America because the Negroes were compelled to live as a separate community. They were herded together as slaves, and after emancipation in 1865, though technically free, they remained segregated from the rest of the American population. However, Negro folk music began to fuse rapidly with European musical forms, and the story of jazz is the result of this fusion. Spanish. Negro music began to fuse with that of the 3 European powers in North America: Spain, France, and England. The Spanish influence is not very important in the history of early jazz, affecting it only as a Spanish tinge in the use of certain rhythms such as the tangana, which was used by W.C. Handy when he wrote St. Louis Blues. The combination of African and Spanish music developed separately to become Latin American music, producing such styles as the calypso, rumba, samba, and mambo. French. The French religious, social, and musical traditions influenced the beginnings of jazz. French rule was tolerant, and West African religion and music survived within the Catholic Church. The Negro later took over the French social tradition of the public festivals and carnivals in which marching bands led parades through the streets. The French musical tradition was equally important because it was assimilated by a class of freed slaves called gens de couleur, or Creoles, and the instruments, instrumental technique, and repertoire of early jazz are unmistakably French, as are the names Baquet, Dominique, Saint-Cyr, Bechet, of many of the early jazz musicians. Anglo-Saxon. In many ways, the Anglo-Saxon contribution to jazz is the most fundamental. The slaves came from a variety of tribes and spoke different languages. English provided a common language for speech and song. Anglo-Saxon folk music provided many songs that later entered the jazz repertoire. Careless Love, for example, was taken from a Kentucky mountain ballad. and St. James Infirmary and Didn't He Ramble can be traced back to Elizabethan folk songs. After 1800, the Protestant religion provided the framework for a systematic blending of African and European music. In the religious fervor of the Great Awakening, the harmonies of the English Protestant hymn were grafted onto the vocal and rhythmic complexity of the Negro. The Anglo-Saxon world has made another contribution to the development of jazz, commercial popular music, or pop music as it is usually called today. This type of music has grown in power and influence, and has adopted, at one time and another, many of the characteristics of jazz. The growth of Negro folk music. The jazz band emerged in New Orleans, a meeting point of French, Spanish, and Anglo-Saxon influences, but the growth of Negro folk music in Anglo-Saxon America has had a deep and lasting influence on the development of jazz. Religious, the Great Awakening. Around 1800, a mass movement known as the Great Awakening produced a religious revival and a religious folk music. Traveling preachers held open-air meetings, often at night by the light of enormous campfires. Their gospel of hellfire and salvation seized huge audiences in the grip of religious hysteria, whipping them into an ecstasy of shouting, screaming, and dancing. In the southern states, the democratic gospel of the poor but fervent Methodist and Baptist denominations appealed to the poor, the outcast, and the Negro slave. By 1820, there were 40,000 Negro Methodists and 60,000 Negro Baptists. The call and response pattern and a compelling rhythm were ideally suited to the needs of outdoor preaching and shouting congregations. The fiery rhythmic phrases of the preacher supplied the call, and the shouting, stamping, and clapping of the congregation the response. Jubilees and spirituals. Because the preacher's words carried a message for which the congregation listened, the melody became more important. The Jubilee, which grew out of the song sermon, has a recognizable melody. The best-known example of a Jubilee, usually a cheerful rhythmic song that announces good news, is When the Saints Go Marching In, a tune that is still sung and played as a call and response. The next step in the blending of African and European forms, from the Jubilee to the spiritual, is quite short and often depended on the mood of the preacher. The mood of the spiritual, one of sadness and deep conviction, does not call for urgent, exciting rhythms. And in spirituals such as Go Down Moses and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, the tempo is slow and the call and response pattern is often dropped. Spirituals were probably sung as early as 1800. After the Civil War, they became the most European and the most popular of all Afro-American music. Segregation. The segregation of Negro churches, which began in 1816, became a mass movement in the Civil War period. Consequently, Negro religious music was allowed to develop on its own. Song sermons, jubilees, spirituals, and gospel songs are still created, altered, and sung by the shouting sects of Negro churches. Negro religious music is still a reservoir of melody and inspiration to the entire jazz tradition, whether expressed in a Chris Barber recording of Precious Lord, Take My Hand, or in Dizzy Gillespie's remark that Milt Jackson of the modern jazz quartet had a fine sense of rhythm because he was a member of a sanctified church. Secular work songs. Work songs were brought over from West Africa by the slaves. Like the sea shanties we know, they were a rhythmic aid to work. The leader of a gang of men improvised short rhythmic phrases, and was answered by his men as their picks or hammers fell together. Work songs retain many West African characteristics, and they can still be heard in prisons in the southern states of America. The blues. The blues are a fluid combination of the field holler, the work song, and Negro religious music. But the blues are different from other combinations of African and European music because a blues is an extended solo performance, a highly personal, individual song commenting on everyday life. The blues began in the rural areas of the South and were probably sung before the Civil War. Early blues had no set length and no prearranged harmonics, but a definite blues form had emerged by the beginning of the 20th century. Most blues are 12 bars long, divided into 3 4-bar groups. The words fit naturally into a 3-line stanza. The first line is repeated, and the third rhymes, more or less, with the first 2. When I got up this morning, blues walking round my bed. When I got up this morning, blues walking round my bed. I went up to eat my breakfast, blues was all in my bread. Leadbelly. There's 19 men living in my neighborhood.
There's 19 men living in my neighborhood. 18 of 'em are fools and the one ain't no doggone good.
Bessie Smith. Each line occupies roughly half the 4-barred unit and is followed by an instrumental response of equal length that leads the singer into the next line. The inner form of the blues is that of the call and response, and this flexible framework gives both singer and accompanist ample scope for improvisation. The scale used in the blues is probably a Negro adaptation of European scales. The easiest way to recognize the blues scale is by its use of approximately flattened thirds and sevenths, E-flat and B-flat in the scale of C. The harmony of the blues is European. The 3 chords of the blues, like those of Silent Night and Swanee River, are built on the 1st, 4th, and 5th notes of the scale, C, F, and G in the scale of C. There has never been a sharp distinction between the blues and religious music, and these chords were probably taken over from the Protestant hymn. Many spirituals are essentially blues, and many blues, for instance, How Long Blues, are derived from spirituals. The African components of the blues, vibrato, variation of pitch and timing, rhythmic freedom and flexibility, call and response, came first. The European elements of length and harmony were absorbed gradually. The blues exist as the finest body of folk poetry in the modern industrial world. They are also the groundwork of jazz, influencing it as a musical form and as a way of feeling and playing. When they cease to be a part of jazz, jazz as we know it will cease to exist. Commercial minstrelsy. A third phase of the blending of African and European music took place within the framework of commercial popular entertainment. Minstrelsy was the first of many examples of the commercial exploitation of Negro musical characteristics. It was pioneered by a German, Gottlieb Graupner, in 1799, when, with cork-blackened face, he sang The Gay Negro Boy in a Boston theater. By 1845 it had become big business and reigned supreme in the world of commercial entertainment until 1900. Although the minstrel show was more of a burlesque than a true imitation of Negro life, it was the first important channel through which Negro influence passed into commercial popular music. Jump Jim Crow, Ta-Ra-Ra Boom Daye, and other minstrel hits were taken over from the Negro. And Swanee River, Camptown Races, and other songs by Stephen Foster introduced characteristic Negro touches into the popular songs of the white public. Minstrelsy was also a training ground for jazz musicians, and many Negro musicians found employment and learned white music in minstrel shows. Ragtime. Ragtime, the first identifiable jazz style, grew up at the end of the 19th century in the Midwest towns of Sedalia and St. Louis. Scott Joplin, the greatest composer of rags, was a Negro, but ragtime was composed and played by both Negro and white pianists who were trained in European music. It was a solo piano music with a form and structure of its own, conceived in the European tradition of written composition. The Negro contribution was syncopated rhythm, a shifting of the accent to the weak beat. By 1900, ragtime had taken over from minstrelsy to become the latest fashion in commercial popular music. An original jazz style had been absorbed and diluted by pop music, and a pattern that runs right through the history of jazz had been established from the start. Between 1900 and 1917, the success of diluted ragtime was overwhelming. It swept America from coast to coast and circled the world, taking London and Paris by storm. The composers of ragtime grew away from jazz. Scott Joplin wrote a stillborn ragtime opera called Tremonisha, and in New York, James P. Johnson worked for years on ragtime concertos, symphonies, and choral works that were never performed. The popular, less complex type of ragtime was adapted for the jazz band. In many parts of America, African and European musical forms were beginning to fuse. The resulting combination existed as an independent religious and secular folk music, or as commercial popular entertainment. By the end of the 19th century, the jazz band, and an instrumental music that would be recognized as jazz, had emerged in New Orleans. Jazz was not born in New Orleans. The fusion of African and European music was taking place in other parts of America. But New Orleans was the cradle of jazz, for it was in New Orleans that the jazz band developed. We know of at least 30 bands that were playing in the city in 1910, and musicians from the city, Bunk Johnson, Alphonse Picou, and Buddy Bolden, who were born as early as the 1870s, have become widely known. New Orleans. By the end of the 19th century, New Orleans was a great city, the largest city in the South and the capital and export port of the cotton country. It was a swarming, prosperous place with a large colored population. There were other great cities in the South with large colored populations, but New Orleans was set apart from the rest of the United States. It was originally French, and then for a short time Spanish. In 1803, along with the surrounding territory of Louisiana, it was sold to the United States. People from the States crowded into New Orleans, and the British and Protestant customs and influence began to be felt. But in spite of this, New Orleans remained, and remains today, an essentially Latin Catholic city. And the French religious, social, and musical traditions were able to make their contribution to the growth of jazz. It became the meeting point of three different European cultural traditions: Spanish, French, and Anglo-Saxon. Each on its own had produced a characteristic fusion of European and West African music. The Spanish in Cuba and South America, the French in Haiti and Martinique, and the Anglo-Saxon in the southern states of North America. New Orleans, opening on to the Spanish Caribbean with its native French culture and Anglo-Saxon hinterland, combined all these as no other area did. Uptown and Downtown. Canal Street, the widest street in the world, was the dividing line between the two colored worlds of New Orleans, uptown and downtown. Long before emancipation, the lighter-skinned Creoles, who were of French, Spanish, and Negro ancestry, had been a class of freed slaves, colored people with the status of white citizens. Some had owned plantations and slaves and sent their children to France to be educated. Many were skilled craftsmen who owned their own homes and businesses. Most of them had a family tradition of legitimate music and had fully assimilated the French musical tradition. The music that was played in Creole homes was sophisticated and European, and until emancipation pushed them uptown, music for most Creoles remained a hobby. The Creoles lived downtown and looked down on the real black and rough Negro element that lived in uptown New Orleans. Until emancipation, the Negroes had been slaves. Many of them had come into the city from the West Indies and the Anglo-Saxon hinterland. They were lower caste and illiterate, the laboring poor of New Orleans. West African music. The changing factors that set New Orleans apart from other American cities helped West African music to survive in uptown New Orleans and to blend with European music. Although the Code Noir of 1724 forbade all but the Catholic religion, the French tolerated a barely Christianized paganism among their slaves. As a result, West African ritual and music were not suppressed, but survived within the structure of the Catholic Church. Private vodun, or voodoo, ceremonies helped to preserve West African musical characteristics. At first these ceremonies were secret and illegal, but Marie Laveau, the most famous of all voodoo queens, had newspaper reporters at her meetings, and gradually voodoo became an accepted part of New Orleans life. In 1817, the Sunday dances of the slaves in Congo Square were made legal, and the ritual and music of voodoo were brought out into the open. The slaves sang and danced to the music of drums, gourds, bamboo tubes, asses' jawbones, rattles, and scrapers. The dances later became a tourist attraction, and the Negroes began to use European instruments and European melodies. The ending of the Congo Square dances, sometime before 1890, left the way open for a freer, more flexible blending of African and European music in the military band music of the street parades of New Orleans. Military bands. The popularity of the military band reached its peak in the France of Napoleon, and New Orleans, a former French colony, followed the fashion closely. Bands were a guaranteed attraction and were employed on almost all occasions: festivals, carnivals, parades, picnics, riverboat excursions, dances, funerals, even prize fights and race meetings. The colored population had its own bands, and after the Civil War, when the pawn shops were filled with instruments left behind by Confederate Army bands, European instruments were within reach of the uptown Negro. Secret societies. Negro life in New Orleans was honeycombed with secret societies and fraternal orders. All these societies demanded bands for the parades, balls, and excursions they organized, and so, by creating a demand for bands, provided musicians with irregular but frequent work. They also paid members burial expenses, and as the body was always buried with music, this gave more work to the bands. These societies were the economic basis of Negro bands in New Orleans, allowing the Negroes to build on the French tradition of parades and festivals, and to experiment with European instruments. The Negro bands forged a strong musical tradition. They built upon the march beat. They borrowed European melodies, and improvised on them. Gradually, they mastered European harmony. We can hear this early Negro band music in the funeral marches, reconstructed on record by Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong, and in Bunk Johnson's description of a funeral. On the way to the cemetery, we would always use slow numbers, such as Nearer My God to Thee, Flee as a Bird to the Mountains. We would use most any 4/4 played very slow. They walked very slow behind the body. We'd march away from the cemetery by the snare drum only, until we got about a block or 2 blocks from the cemetery. Then we go right into ragtime, what the people today call swing, ragtime. We would play Didn't He Ramble, or we'd take all those spiritual hymns and turn them into ragtime. Step lively, everybody. When the Saints Go Marching In, Ain't Gonna Study War No More, and several others, we play them just for that effect. Emancipation. Emancipation brought segregation and systematic racial discrimination. Because of its French legacy of tolerance, the results were slow to affect New Orleans. But by the 1890s, the Creoles were gradually being pushed out of jobs that could be done by white men, and were sliding down the social and economic ladder. Their downfall was slow but complete. Music, which had been a hobby, became a source of extra income and eventually a profession. The Creoles, pushed uptown, had to play with the Negro. They brought European techniques and know-how to uptown music, but to hold their own they had to play dirty and improvise like the Negro. A new way of playing developed. It was a combination of the rough, improvised style of the Negro and the formal training of the Creole, held together by the rhythm of the military band. The freeing of the slaves also broke the pattern of the old slave culture, and in time produced a laboring poor free to choose its own entertainment. By the beginning of the 20th century, the large colored populations in New Orleans and other cities, swollen by an influx of Negroes from the country, formed a large, scarcely exploited audience, needing a special type of entertainment. The jazz band was a product of the city. It grew out of an already existing form of urban entertainment, the public musical parade. The music of uptown New Orleans was not yet called jazz. It was referred to as ragtime or as Creole music. It quickly began to produce its popular figures and its legendary heroes. It was still a folk music, but its early days in New Orleans saw a significant change in its character. Buddy Bolden. Many legends have grown up around the life and music of Charles Buddy Bolden, the first great figure of jazz. He was the first king of jazz, idolized by his public, and it has been reported, with probably more admiration than accuracy, that on a clear night his cornet could be heard 10 or 12 miles away. He was heir to all the influences that shaped jazz. He grew up in a brass band craze and mastered a European instrument, the cornet. He was a member of the shouting church congregation. He knew the blues. He probably knew of Voodoo practices, and he is almost certain to have seen the Congo Square dances. He was born in 1868 in uptown New Orleans. He kept a barber shop, edited and published a newspaper called The Cricket, and around 1895 organized the first jazz band. In 1907, his hectic life caught up with him, and he went mad before a large Negro audience during a street parade. Bolden's band usually consisted of cornet, clarinet, trombone, guitar, string bass, and drums. It played at saloons, dance halls, parades, picnics, carnivals, and parks. Bolden's favorite place of work was the Tintype Hall, a building that was used as a morgue during the day and a dance hall at night. The band played French and Creole tunes such as polkas and quadrilles, ragtime, which was the popular music of the day, and the blues. Bolden's music sounded rough and unfamiliar. The musicians were playing European instruments without any formal training, and as a result the instruments became an extension of the Negro voice, producing a throbbing, breathy tone quite unlike the pure instrumental European sound. Instrumental technique had been vocalized, and jazz had been given its most characteristic sound, vibrato. Most of the musicians could not read music, and the tune became a jumping-off point for melodic and rhythmic variations. Mutt Carey, another early cornet player, helps us to understand the beginning of jazz tone and improvisation when he says, "If you can't sing it, you can't play it. I sing what I feel and try to reproduce it on my horn." The result was a new music, an elementary form of jazz that would be recognizable today. New Orleans style. Before the end of the century, there were other bands playing in the Bolden manner, and a New Orleans style developed. It was an ensemble style. The musicians played together, and there was little room for solo passages. The rhythmic instruments provided a steady, simple beat. The cornet was the lead instrument, and played the melody or simple variations on it. The clarinet played its own melody between the notes of the cornet, and in answer to them. The trombone filled in the bass harmonies, playing its own melody in answer to the cornet's lead. Normally, the clarinet played above and the trombone below the notes of the cornet. This was an extension of the call and response pattern. The cornet was the leader, answering by the responses of the clarinet and trombone. But now the call and response overlapped continually. The New Orleans bands played rags and blues, but tunes derived from French marches, polkas, and quadrilles were the basis of their repertoire. An adaptation of a quadrille called La Marseillaise, not the French national anthem, was originally called Praline. Later versions of the tune were known as Get Outta Here and Go Home, Jack Carey, and Number 2 Rag, until in 1917 it was recorded by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, under the title by which we now know it, Tiger Rag. The musicians. The early New Orleans jazzmen were part-time musicians. They worked during the week and played at weekends. Alphonse Bacou, a Creole who worked out the famous clarinet chorus in high society, tells how, "I worked at my trade as a tinsmith all week, but all day Saturday I would play in a wagon to advertise the dance that night. Play all night. On Sunday he would play for the picnic at the lake, and at a dance all Sunday night. Sometimes his clarinet seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. The early Creole musicians were skilled craftsmen, painters, plasterers, tinsmiths, engravers, cigar makers. A few owned small businesses. The Negroes worked as manual laborers on the docks and in the factories. Their music did not set them apart from their audience. During the week they worked alongside their audience, and at weekends their music was a part of the everyday life of the colored community of the city. It was a poor man's music, a folk music, but it was happy and tuneful, and it expressed the feelings of a tightly knit community that, on the whole, enjoyed life. Storyville. The opening of Storyville changed the character of New Orleans jazz. The city was vice-ridden and corrupt. In 1897, gambling, prostitution, and dope peddling were legalized and restricted to certain streets known as Storyville. In 1910, the owner of a cabaret in Storyville hired a band and entertainers. Soon a dozen or so bands were kept working regularly, and the best musicians, Negro and Creole, were playing in Storyville because the pay was every night. Jazz in Storyville was no longer a part-time occupation, but a full-time profession. Storyville established the solo pianist. The professors, as they were called, could make more money than the musicians and the bands. The wages were not much better, but tips were plentiful and did not have to be shared. Jelly Roll Morton made more in his first night in Storyville than he did in a week working in a barrel factory. The hours of work were long, and professors, such as Morton, Tony Jackson, the Game Kid, Skinnyhead Pete, and Slap Rags White, would still be playing low-down blues, ragtime, and their sensational trick and surprise effects in the early hours of the morning. Jazz in the open air. Jazz flourished in Storyville, but the band still played for picnics, parades, riverboat excursions, funerals, festivals, carnivals, and election campaigns. Another thing that brought jazz out into the open air was its use as advertisement. Bands, engaged to play at a dance or a picnic, would be sent out in decorated wagons to advertise the function. When two wagons met, the bands would play a musical duel to prove which was the better, and to attract an audience for the evening. Wagons were often tied together to ensure that a weaker band could not evade a contest. These battles of music, known as cutting or carving contests, have occurred in one form or another throughout the history of jazz. Along with competition, there was a pooling of ideas. After work, the musicians would meet in the 25 Club to practice and exchange ideas. Established musicians helped less experienced ones. King Oliver taught Armstrong. George Baquet and Louis Big Eye Nelson taught Sidney Bechet and Johnny Dodds, and a musical tradition was handed on. The bands of the city were hero-worshipped, and alongside every parade marched a second line of people following the band, all in the street, all on the sidewalks. Prominent in the second line were the boys of New Orleans, whose ambition was to play in a band and be part of the color and gaiety of a parade, particularly the Mardi Gras parade, the climax of the year. Some of these boys formed bands that played on the pavements outside saloons and theaters. Their bands were called spasm bands. The best known consisted of white boys aged between 13 and 15, known by such names as Stalebread Charlie, Warm Gravy, Chiney, Whiskey, and Slewfoot Pete. They played freak instruments, bass fiddles with bodies made out of sugar barrels and a clothesline for a string, soapbox fiddles, cowbells, old kettles, and links of gas piping. In some cases, spasm bands were a training ground for musicians. Stalebread himself later became a full-time musician, playing piano in New Orleans and on riverboats, and Louis Armstrong began his musical career in the streets of New Orleans playing a guitar made of a cigar box and singing tenor in a children's quartet. Dixieland. Jazz was not exclusively a colored possession. The poor whites from the slums in New Orleans also played a part in the story of early jazz. Papa Jack Lane was the most influential figure in white New Orleans jazz. At one time, he ran 3 brass bands as well as several dance bands. Lane's bands adopted the colored New Orleans style, played it less movingly, and added a little to it. Their syncopated music became the foundation of Dixieland jazz, named after the word Dix that was printed in large letters on the $10 bills issued in the southern states. All the white musicians played in Lane's bands at one time or another, and later some of them went north to spread the fame of Dixieland music. The early years of the 20th century saw the beginning of a unique expansion that, in later years, was to make jazz an international language. Between 1900 and 1917, jazz, though still called by a variety of names, became the popular music of the Negro population of North America. New Orleans style. New Orleans style was not the only way of playing jazz. The combination of African and European musical forms was taking place in many parts of North America, but New Orleans music was the most fully formed, and, because it had an obvious influence on the later development of jazz, has been the most fully documented of the early styles of jazz. Musicians from New Orleans quickly discovered the possibilities of engagements farther afield, and they played in traveling Wild West shows, circuses, and minstrel troupes. Bunk Johnson and Jelly Roll Morton were 2 of the many New Orleans musicians who worked in vaudeville and minstrel shows. Bands also helped to spread the New Orleans style. As early as 1891, the Onward Brass Band had traveled as far as New York to take part in and win a brass band contest. Later bands made more extensive tours. Between 1912 and 1918, the original Creole Orchestra, featuring cornet player Freddie Keppard, was in and out of New Orleans in between tours that took it to Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. Many New Orleans musicians went north to Chicago. The Mississippi paddle wheelers that carried people up and down the river also provided entertainment at stopping places along the route. Between 1910 and 1920, nearly all the well-known New Orleans jazzmen played on these floating dance halls. The boats provided a series of stepping stones to Chicago, and a way back if conditions in the north were too hard. Wherever New Orleans musicians went, their way of playing obviously influenced other musicians. But their way of playing was not the only way. On the riverboats, for example, Charlie Creeth from St. Louis led what was said to have been the finest band on the river, and by 1900 a definite band style was emerging in such places as Atlanta, Mobile, Memphis, and Charleston. In the southwest and eastern states, there were ragtime and minstrel bands, and in the northeast there were bands that played in a style that was a mixture of military and religious music. Pianists. New Orleans pianists were always on the move, playing wherever they could find a piano and a job. After 1904, Jelly Roll Morton used New Orleans only as a base of operations. He traveled extensively, spreading New Orleans piano style and making good money. New Orleans piano style was one of many separate regional styles, ranging in a variety of combinations, from sophisticated ragtime to a surging rhythmic style based on the blues and religious music. In the Midwest and East, it was generally ragtime. In the South and Southwest, a style based on the blues and often referred to as a fast Western style was popular in the turpentine and railroad construction camps. In the Northeast, there was a piano style based on ragtime and the music of shouting religious sects. There were famous pianists outside New Orleans. Brocky Johnny played in Mobile, Benny French in Memphis, and Porter King in Pensacola, Florida. Many others were legendary figures with names like Cat Eye Harry, One Leg Shadow, Bendin' Boots, and the Toothpick. It was possible to tell where a man came from by the way he played, and competition among pianists from different areas was fierce. The blues. There were other influences besides that of New Orleans: ragtime, minstrelsy, Negro religious music, and the blues. During the early years of the 20th century, the blues developed in 3 different ways. country, classic, and commercial. After the Civil War, the development of the early blues had been speeded up by professional minstrels and wandering beggars, many of them blind, who roamed the southern states. Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, born in Louisiana in 1888 and raised in Texas, ran away from home at the age of 16 to begin his ramblings all over the South. He became one of the many singers who carried on the tradition of the country blues. Their music made no impression on the cities, and they continued to work alone or in pairs, playing their jigs, reels, ballads, and blues at square dances and breakdowns in the rural areas of the South. The tradition of country blues was an oral tradition handed on from one blues singer to another. Leadbelly was for a time the guide and disciple of Blind Lemon Jefferson, and learned much about the blues as they worked together. They, and many unknown singers like them, played an important part in the history of jazz by keeping alive a folk music to which jazzmen have turned again and again. The classic blues developed out of the music of Leadbelly and other rural folk singers. It was exclusively a woman's art. Gertrude Pridgett, who adopted the stage name of Ma Rainey, was the first and certainly one of the greatest of the women blues singers. She and others like her were professional music hall stars, and they toured the southern states, singing in tent shows, theaters, cabarets, and meeting houses. By 1917, W.C. Handy had published several blues. He came from a shouting Methodist family, and became a musician in the face of strong family opposition. He began to listen to wandering blues singers, and he was convinced that folks would pay money if the music was polished up. His blues were taken from a variety of sources: Yellow Dog blues from the Song of a Negro Tramp, and the last strain of St. Louis blues from a sermon in Alabama. By proving that the blues could be written down and sold, Handy anticipated the later commercial exploitation of the blues and of jazz. Mass migration. The spread of jazz was also part of a wider shift of population, of a general movement among the Negroes from the country to the city, from the South to the North. From about 1916 on, the Negroes flooded north in extraordinary numbers, and before 1920, the colored population of Chicago trebled and that of Harlem, New York, doubled. Some of the factors that contributed to this transfer of population stand out clearly. The boll weevil, a termite that attacks the cotton plant, was making work scarce in the South, and by 1917 New Orleans was sunk in a business depression. Rapidly expanding industry made work plentiful in the Midwest and on the Atlantic seaboard. In the northern states there had never been a slave code, real or imaginary, and the money a Negro could earn proclaimed him a free man. So said the rumors about better pay and living conditions that filtered down from the North. The Negroes began to pour into the stockyards, packing plants, foundries, steel mills, and railroad shops of the northern states. Jazz spread with the migrants, and the movements of musicians followed those of the ordinary Negroes. Just as migrants from the Mississippi Delta were likely to move up the river toward Chicago, so were the New Orleans and Memphis musicians. As ordinary Negroes from the eastern states moved toward New York, so did the musicians from these areas. Migrants and musicians from Oklahoma and Texas moved towards Kansas City. And because jazz, in a variety of forms, had become the popular music of the American Negro, the movements of musicians also followed the traditional touring routes of blues singers, minstrel shows, and riverboat bands. The movement of New Orleans musicians to Chicago was accelerated by the closing of Storyville in 1917. For a time, many of them were out of work, and they went to Chicago via the riverboat bands. By 1920, there were over 40 outstanding New Orleans musicians in Chicago, but Benny Moten's 1922 Kansas City band was drawn from musicians from the Southwest states, and the musicians in Duke Ellington's 1924 band in New York came from the eastern states. New Orleans was the focal point of the South, and New Orleans style was the most fully formed, and therefore the most influential of early jazz styles. But other large cities and other styles in various parts of North America also made their contributions to the development and spread of jazz. By the 20s, particularly in Chicago and New York, and later in Kansas City, jazz emerged as a highly varied music, a national language with different dialects. Before 1917, jazz had become the popular music of the American Negro, and some characteristics of jazz through ragtime and minstrelsy had been assimilated by white commercial popular music. Between 1917 and 1929, a highly diluted version of jazz became the dance music and popular song of the Western world. the original Dixieland Jazz Band. 1917 is a convenient date for the beginning of the Jazz Age. In that year, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, a white group from New Orleans, played at Reisenweber's restaurant in New York and was a sensational success. Overnight, jazz became a household word. The origin of the word itself is obscure, and there have been many explanations of its meaning and derivation. According to Nick LaRocca, cornet player with the ODJB, the word had been adopted after a drunken customer in Chicago had shouted to the band to "jazz it up," and the word jazz or jazz had appeared in Chicago in the early teens with an unprintable meaning. Wherever it came from, it soon had a commercial value. The original impact of the ODJB was quickly diluted by a host of imitators. There were jazz bands everywhere, even in London as early as 1917, copying not the music but the novelty effects and the funny hats of the ODJB. Paul Whiteman. Paul Whiteman tried to make jazz respectable. His band, the largest yet, played carefully rehearsed arrangements that incorporated as many semi-classical devices as possible. His publicity agents crowned him King of Jazz, and to white audiences of the 20s, jazz meant Whiteman's symphonized syncopation, the barnyard imitations and novelty effects of the many imitators of the ODJB, or simply a word to describe a mad, gay, frantic, desperate era known as the Jazz Age, or the Roaring Twenties. The Mound City Blue Blowers. There was virtually no white public for jazz, but there were white musicians who played jazz, or hot music, as it was called in the Jazz Age. The Mound City Blue Blowers were a group of noisy amateurs led by an overweight ex-jockey called Red McKenzie. They played banjo, kazoo, and comb and paper. Their music was the sort of rough and ready music that had been played in New Orleans by the spasm bands. They played loudly, rhythmically, and as hot as they knew how, but their records were hits mainly because they were sold as instrumental novelties. Bix Beiderbecke. The career of Bix Beiderbecke illustrates some of the difficulties of the hot musician. He began his career with a small group called the Wolverines before joining the big bands of Charlie Straight, Gene Goldkett, and Paul Whiteman. As a featured soloist with Whiteman, he was well paid and admired by fellow musicians, but the frustration of playing the same arrangements night after night, and of being allowed to play so little when he was capable of playing so much, led to many personal problems. Like other hot soloists in big bands, he began to play one way for a living, and another, with various small recording groups and at informal jam sessions, for other musicians, and a small but loyal audience of followers of hot music. The clear, bell-like tone and the veiled melancholy of his cornet playing can be heard on the records he made with Whiteman and with various small groups of inferior musicians. He left Whiteman because of ill health. For a time he concentrated on piano, and his compositions show his liking for Debussy, Ravel, and Stravinsky. In 1931, his health ruined by drink, he died of pneumonia at the age of 28. Chicago. The Wolverines were not the only small white band playing hot jazz. The New Orleans Rhythm Kings played in Chicago and were a definite and immediate influence on 5 Chicago youngsters who were still attending Austin High School. They listened to records of the Rhythm Kings and tried to copy them note for note. When they heard the colored New Orleans bands of King Oliver and Jimmy Noon, they idolized the musicians and began to copy them. The Austin High School gang was joined by other musicians who thought the same way about jazz. White musicians from New Orleans, like George Brunis, who played trombone with the Rhythm Kings, regarded themselves as entertainers, as players of popular music. The Chicagoans played a type of music they knew would be misunderstood by the public, and they refused to compromise. Some saw themselves as rebels against their own middle-class background and the whole American way of life. They were painstaking copyists of New Orleans music, and they were rather proud of their narrow-minded, dedicated isolation. The Chicagoans played against the background of Al Capone's gangster epic. They played in nightclubs run by gangsters, and are said to have continued playing in the middle of gunfights. It has been argued that because of this hectic background, the records made by McPartland, Spanier, Teschmaker, Freeman, Condon, and others sound tough and hard-boiled. It is obvious that because they were trying to copy and master a new musical idiom, the music of the Chicagoans, although sometimes exciting, was often harsh and self-conscious. The 5 Pennies. The Rhythm Kings and the Chicagoans copied the New Orleans colored style of jazz. In New York, there was a white style derived from white musicians and based on ragtime and Dixieland. Until the Chicagoans came to New York in the late 20s, this Eastern style owed little to the New Orleans tradition. The numerous records made by small groups formed for record sessions by Red Nichols are examples of this Eastern style. Nichols, who played cornet, maintained a high standard over hundreds of records. Trombonist Miff Mole, the only New Yorker in Nichols' groups, was typical of a new kind of jazzman. He was a trained and accomplished musician, a fine technician, reliable and consistent. Nichols' groups were known by a variety of names: the Five Pennies, the Goofus Five, Miff Mole and his Molars, the New York Syncopators, and many others. And they introduced many jazz musicians, such as Jack Teagarden, Eddie Lang, Benny Goodman, Pee Wee Russell, and Bud Freeman, to a large audience. The music was smooth, elegant, polished, influenced by European musical practices, a sort of chamber music jazz. It was not very exciting, but it was pleasant and tasteful, and maintained a consistently high level of musicianship. The white contribution to jazz in the 20s was sometimes dedicated, often tasteful and polished. It added little that was original or lasting to the development of jazz, but the attitudes of white musicians were to be paralleled in later years by both white and colored jazzmen. The two main centers of jazz activity for both white and Negro musicians were Chicago and New York. Jazz played by white bands, because of greater publicity, was more famous than that of Negro groups. The colored musicians of the 20s played in virtual segregation, but their innovations reshaped the course of jazz. Chicago. The Negro migration to the northern cities had produced an uprooted urban proletariat. In Chicago, nostalgia for the South created a demand for music from back home. This explains the popularity of the blues, New Orleans-style jazz, and of numerous tunes like Canal Street Blues named after places in the South. Negro musicians played almost exclusively for the Negro population that lived in the slums of Chicago's South Side. Small clubs, cabarets, and dance halls sprang up in hundreds. Many of them featured 3- or 4-piece bands using kazoos, jugs, and washboards, as well as more orthodox instruments. House rent parties, held to help pay the rent, were an important part of the social life of South Side. Usually the party centered around a pianist who played a fast blues style, his right hand improvising short rhythmic phrases against the steady rolling bass set up by his left. Many of these left-hand figures became standardized and were known as the Fives, the Chains, the Rocks, and the Dirty Dozen. Boogie-woogie, as the style was called, had grown out of the fast Western style. It was at its vigorous best in the hands of Albert Ammons, Speckled Red, Meade Lux Lewis, Cripple Clarence Lofton, and, before he was killed in a dance hall brawl, Pinetop Smith. Many of the boogie-woogie pianists sang the blues, and the rent parties in Chicago, and in every other city where there was a Negro community, provided the blues singers with a city audience. Leroy Carr was the most influential of the early city blues singers. He made many records, often accompanied by guitarist Scrapper Blackwell, before he was poisoned in 1935 by the woman he was living with. His most famous song was How Long Blues, and he made several recordings of it in his gentle lyrical style. Bessie Smith. The classic blues, pioneered by Ma Rainey, continued to be sung by the women singers who toured the tent shows and vaudeville stages of the South. In the 20s, they came into Chicago and New York, where the Negro communities and recording studios gave them a wider audience. With conscious dramatic effect, they expanded and reshaped the blues into an entertainment form of tremendous impact and beauty. The most popular, and the greatest, of all classic blues singers was Bessie Smith. During her days of stardom, she recorded over 150 songs and sold between 8 and 10 million records. In the most magnificent of all blues voices, and with a deep and wary bitterness, she sang of the harsh facts of life. In records such as Reckless Blues and Young Woman's Blues, she was truly the empress of the blues. But by 1928, the classic blues were virtually dead, and she reached out for a wider audience by singing and recording popular music hall songs. She brought blues feeling and imaginative phrasing to this new material, reshaping the tune and lyrics of songs like Cakewalkin' Babies and Alexander's Ragtime Band. In this way, she was one of the founders of a new type of jazz singing that was developed by later singers in the 30s and still flourishes today. Bessie Smith grew up in the slums of Nashville, Tennessee, and began her professional career touring the tent shows of the South with Ma Rainey's Rabbit Foot Minstrels. Her life was as painful, bitter, and ironic as her songs. When she sang, "You can't trust nobody, you might as well be alone," she was singing from hard experience. She was alone all her life, even in her days as a star. Gradually, her zest for life turned into drunken excess. Her warmth and passion became jealousy and rage. She became temperamental and difficult to work with and slipped back into the obscurity of the tent shows of the South. In 1937, she was killed by white neglect after a motor accident. King Oliver. In Chicago, the nostalgia that created a demand for blues singers and pianists also provided an audience for New Orleans-style bands. The most popular and influential band was led by King Oliver, who had come up from New Orleans. In 1920, he formed his own band and played at the Dreamland Cafe till 1 a.m., and then at the Pekin Cafe until 6 a.m. In 1922, he sent for Louis Armstrong, and in 1923, his 7- and sometimes 8-piece Creole orchestra recorded 37 sides for 4 different record companies. These records were the first and almost certainly the finest examples of New Orleans jazz on record. Snake Rag illustrates the well-balanced, compact, driving New Orleans ensemble style and the exciting 2 cornet breaks of Oliver and Armstrong. Canal Street Blues and other records are examples of well-knit ensemble playing, with solos from cornet, Honor Dutri's trombone, and Johnny Dodd's clarinet. Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton may not have invented jazz as he claimed, but he was a musician of originality and influence. He began his career as a Storyville professor, and then spent much of his life touring the South, California, and the Midwest. He was a frequent visitor to Chicago, where in the early 20s he made many records. He was a highly personal, original pianist, but he was also an arranger, composer, organizer, and leader of jazz bands. In 1926, he began a series of recordings under the name of Jelly Roll Morton and his Red Hot Peppers. All the Red Hot Peppers records are dominated by his forceful personality. He was probably the first true composer of jazz, able to set down his ideas on paper, and to arrange his compositions for bands of varying sizes and personnel. He knew how to choose the best musicians for his purposes, and how to get the best out of them. His standards were exacting, and he insisted on intensive rehearsal before a recording was made. In this way, he molded some of the great jazz musicians, Kid Ory, Omer Simeon, George Mitchell, Johnny Dodds, Barney Biggard, to his own ideas and produced a series of records that were individual, original, and effective. The breaking of the New Orleans mold. King Oliver's Creole orchestra had perfected the New Orleans ensemble style of playing. Morton had broadened and reshaped it, but New Orleans style, as a band style, was unadaptable, and the Austin High School gang were its only followers. As an individual way of playing, it was kept alive by New Orleans musicians even when they had finally broken away from the tight-knit ensemble style. Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong almost single-handedly changed the face of jazz in the 20s. What he played then has seeped into the language of jazz, and his influence is still felt today. He was born in 1900 and grew up in the seamy slums of uptown New Orleans. When he was 12, he let off a pistol in the streets on New Year's Eve and was sent to a reform school. Here he was taught to play cornet, and within a few years of leaving he was playing professionally in New Orleans. In the 20s in Chicago and New York he became a big recording name and led his own recording groups. Armstrong broke away from the New Orleans ensemble style to emerge as a solo virtuoso. His first Hot 5 and 7 recording groups were composed of New Orleans musicians who were powerful direct ensemble players. Muskrat Ramble, made in 1926, is a fine example of well-integrated ensemble playing. Other records show the development of a 3-part musical form in which there was an opening ensemble section led by the cornet, a middle section of solos by different instruments, and a final exhilarating ride-out by the whole band. But as early as 1926 and 1927, records like Cornet Chop Suey and Potato Head Blues were showcases for Armstrong's daring and successful solo work. His new Hot 7, formed in 1928, left the ensemble style completely. In records such as West End Blues, Squeeze Me, and Tight Like This, he expanded the jazz solo and gave it a grand structure of its own. It was a logical step to take the solo out of the ensemble and set it up in concerto form, with Armstrong playing his explosive solos in front of and above the rest of the band. Some of his best work has been done as a strong, soaring solo trumpet, and as a vocalist, in front of comparatively large bands. He had a truly remarkable command of his instrument, and a fire and beauty that have never been surpassed, but his great strength lay in the fact that he had firm roots in the music of New Orleans. His big warm tone and broad fast vibrato had been developed within the New Orleans ensemble style. This background gave him a firm basis for his dazzling flights of instrumental virtuosity, and he was able to pass logically from the folk jazz of New Orleans to complete individualism. There were other New Orleans musicians who were changing the pattern of New Orleans style. Both Jimmy Noon on clarinet and Sidney Bechet on clarinet and soprano saxophone were bursting through the limitations of small band ensemble style, but their innovations did not have the widespread influence of Armstrong's. He made the biggest impact of any single man in jazz, and his sweeping innovations were not carried further until a new generation of jazzmen arose in the 30s. New York. By 1926, New York, because it controlled most of the music business, had become the new center of jazz activity, and most jazzmen had gone or were going east. By 1926, too, it was obvious that there was a new attitude among northern Negroes. The urbanized Negroes, particularly in Harlem, began to feel contempt for the South and all it stood for. Nostalgia for the South was replaced by a demand for city ways, emancipation, and progress. The popularity of New Orleans-style jazz declined, and new styles developed. Harlem. Harlem, like the South Side, had its rent parties centered round a pianist. The Harlem pianists had developed a style of their own called stride piano, or Eastern style. Its leaders were James P. Johnson, Willie the Lion Smith, and Fats Waller. Others were known by such colorful names as Lucky Roberts, Jack the Bear, One Leg Willie, the Beetle, and Lippy. Several pianists often took part in cutting contests, and their showpieces for these competitions, ragtime variations called shouts, sounded above the din of the party. But unlike boogie-woogie pianists, the Harlem piano players were musically well educated, and some, like Johnson, were schooled musicians and composers in the European tradition. The clubs in Harlem were continually opening, shutting, and changing their names, but all of them featured jazz. Jazz musicians played in such places as Small's Paradise, the Garden of Joy, the Nest Club, the Bandbox, and the Bucket of Blood. The Big Band. New York saw the beginning of the big Negro swing band, and jazz adapted itself to the needs of a larger band of as many as 14 and 15 players compared to the 6 or 7 of a New Orleans group. The enlargement of the band and the systematic use of saxophones presented new problems of instrumental style, arrangement, and composition. These problems were not solved in any universal way, and many big bands worked out a variety of solutions. They were finally solved by Fletcher Henderson in what was to become the big band formula of later years, and by Duke Ellington in a highly individual way that has never been successfully copied, though its influence has been felt throughout the entire jazz idiom. Fletcher Henderson. In 1922, Henderson, who came from Georgia, had a 10-man band, only 2 more than Oliver's Creole Orchestra. But the 2 extra men played saxophone, and he had 3 saxophones in the band making a section. When he enlarged his band to include 3 trumpets, 3 saxophones, 2 trombones, piano, guitar, bass, and drums, he had 12 men working in unison. More important still, he had 4 sections: trumpet and trombone, often joined to form a brass section, saxophone, and rhythm. Henderson and his arranger Don Redman worked out a successful formula for the big band. Redman's arrangements consisted mainly of written passages for the whole band and for the different sections, the building up of rhythmic backgrounds, and improvised solos by individual musicians. He exploited the call and response pattern, using 2- and 4-bar phrases, often built on the blues, repeated in turn by different sections. Brass would answer reeds, the whole band would answer and build a rhythmic background for trumpet or saxophone. Such arrangements demanded talented writing and a high level of musicianship from players who had to handle section work and solos with drive and jazz feeling. Many of the early arrangements sound awkward today, but records by the band still sound fresh because of solos by Armstrong, Jimmy Harrison, Hawkins, and other great musicians of the 20s. Henderson's was not the only big band, but his solution to the resulting problems, nurtured and tested in the clubs of Harlem, became the big band formula of later years and was the first link between the collective improvising of New Orleans style and the sections of a big band playing from written arrangements. He came to the answer gradually and achieved a revolution in jazz, less by seeking changes than by adapting to new conditions and new demands. Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was born in Washington in 1899. By 1917, he was leading a band called the Washingtonians, and in 1924, the band moved to New York, where it played in nightclubs, building up a repertoire and a reputation, and adding new musicians. In 1927, it took over the permanent residency at the Cotton Club. Ellington played piano, but it soon became obvious that his real instrument was his orchestra. He used it as a lesser man would use a single instrument, making it fully capable of expressing his ideas. Bubber Miley on trumpet and Tricky Sam Nanton on trombone were key figures in the band. Miley was a superb blues player, and both he and Nanton were masters in the art of using mutes to make their instruments growl and produce bizarre noises and highly vocalized wah-wah effects in a violent, dramatic style. Ellington used this growl style, the Creole clarinet of New Orleans-born Barney Biggard, and the graceful flowing lines of Johnny Hodges' alto saxophone to create a sound from his band that was as distinctive and personal as that of an individual soloist. Ellington's music is European in form and harmony, but it has always been based on the fundamentals of jazz, and many of his compositions were built on the blues and religious music. What he did was to reconstruct the old materials of jazz into a new form, creating a music of his own out of the basic structure of jazz. Consequently, no band has ever successfully copied his style. His career has been a continuous process of discovery, innovation, and experiment. He is still the foremost composer of jazz and the leader of its most famous orchestra. To the present day, he has maintained a high standard of musical intelligence and achievement, and his work has always been so completely original that he cannot be measured by any standards but his own. The musicians, new styles. The early 20s had seen the emergence of the virtuoso soloist. New Orleans musicians had burst through the limitations of the New Orleans small band ensemble. Musicians from outside New Orleans extended the range and possibilities and reshaped the styles of other instruments. Earl Hines from Pittsburgh made the piano a dominant voice in the band and pioneered a flexible, flowing style, phrasing like a trumpet or clarinet, and even introducing an artificial vibrato. In recorded piano solos and on records with Armstrong and Noon, he used the whole range of the piano to create a graceful, intricate, but dynamic style. The musicians who played with the big bands in New York developed the possibilities of the trombone and made the saxophone a jazz instrument. The trombone had not realized its instrumental possibilities in New Orleans jazz. Jimmy Harrison's concise, lyrical style made it as supple and expressive a solo instrument as trumpet or clarinet. He died young, but his ideas shaped the playing of his contemporaries. J.C. Higginbottom played in a remarkably flexible but powerful style, and Jack Teagarden, one of the very few Red Indians in jazz, evolved an exact and classical style, relaxed and elegant. The instruments of early jazz had come mainly from the French classical orchestra and the military band. The saxophone entered jazz by way of pop music. During the 20s and 30s, jazz musicians developed a technique for it and made its remarkable flexibility, expressiveness, and drive available to the jazz band. One man, Coleman Hawkins, is responsible for making the tenor saxophone into a solo instrument. He had the same impact on tenor players as Armstrong did on trumpeters. Virtually all the tenor men of the 20s and 30s copied his style. Unlike Armstrong, he had no instrumental tradition to build on. Single-handed, he developed a vast sound with a cutting edge, a breathy tone, and a wide vibrato. 2 recordings he made in 1929 with the Mound City Blue Blowers show how he developed the possibilities of the tenor. 1 Hour, an example of his rhapsodic mood, is played with a soft but powerful tone. Hello Lola is played at a faster tempo with greater invention, a bustling fury, and a flurry of notes. In different ways, Johnny Hodges, Benny Carter, and Willie Smith were doing for the alto what Hawkins had done for the tenor. Hodges with an easy gracefulness, Carter with a poised elegance, and Smith with a big tone and vigorous attack molded the flexible melodic beauty of the alto to the jazz idiom. New attitudes. Early jazz on the whole had been the music of the unskilled working class, or of traditional show business people. A number of the musicians who played in the 20s came from middle-class families. Ellington was able to stay at school until he was 18 and chose a musical career instead of an art scholarship. Henderson studied chemistry and maths at Atlantic University. Redmond studied music at Storer College and then at conservatories in Boston and Detroit. The folk music element was always strong in the attitude of Armstrong, Bechet, and other New Orleans musicians. They were looking back on a tradition, and this gave them their strength and confidence. The 20s saw the emergence of great jazzmen who had not grown up in the New Orleans tradition. Hawkins was not concerned with tradition, but with technicalities. In place of tradition, he had a musical education and an interest in the latest developments in harmony, composition, and theory. Jazz became a matter of keeping up with new ideas and constantly expanding one's technical equipment and musical knowledge. Bolden in New Orleans had been a folk artist. Armstrong in Chicago a virtuoso. Hawkins and players like him were schooled and sophisticated professionals. The middle-class Negro might have a university education, but jazz was still one of the few ways he could rise in wealth, achievement, and social status, particularly as the end of the 20s saw the beginning of the presentation of music played by Negroes for white audiences. Ellington played to white audiences at the Cotton Club, Henderson for white dancers at the Roseland Ballroom, and Armstrong appeared in Broadway revues, and later went to Hollywood. It was becoming easier for the Negro entertainer to win fame and partial acceptance outside his race, but this was a development that was held up by the Depression. In November 1929, the New York stock market crashed. In 1930, 1,000 banks failed. America was entering the Great Depression, a 5-year period of widespread unemployment and rapidly growing slums. There was still a small market for jazz, but it was not nearly large enough to absorb all the musicians who had played in the 20s. Jazz almost disappeared in America, but in Kansas City, one city not affected by the Depression, the existing styles of jazz were reshaped and the seeds of new development sown. The musicians. Some white musicians sought refuge in pop bands and the staff orchestras of radio stations. The Chicagoans in New York lived on transparent hamburgers and salt and pepper sandwiches. Many colored musicians continued to try to make a living. Morton scuffled around Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Oliver struggled for a living in the South, cheated by agents, dogged by misfortune and ill health, and forgotten by the public. Many broken by poverty in their vain attempts to form bands went back to laboring. Mutt Carey worked as a postman and a porter, Oliver as an attendant in a billiard hall, Bunk Johnson on a sugar plantation. Europe. Although jazz was virtually dead in America, there was a modest but constant demand for jazz in Europe. Many of the great colored musicians toured Europe, and some came over to work. Ellington, Armstrong, and Fats Waller played to appreciative audiences. Coleman Hawkins and Benny Carter worked in Europe for some years. Both played and recorded with European musicians who began to form their own bands. The most ambitious and original European jazz band was the quintet of the Hot Club of France, an all-string group formed in 1934. 2 guitars and string bass formed the rhythm section, and the melody was played by a front line of violin and guitar. In spite of a mutilated left hand, gypsy guitarist Django Reinhardt had an amazing technique and played fluent, imaginative solos of great power and beauty. Reinhardt made many records with the quintet, but much of his best work was done in the company of visiting American musicians. He played fine rhythm and solo guitar on records with violinist Eddie South, with Rex Stewart and Barney Biggard of the Ellington Band, and with trombonist Dickie Wells and other musicians from Teddy Hill's band. Kansas City. In America, jazz was still played in Harlem, which became a meeting place for talented musicians, but the most important developments in the reshaping of jazz were taking place in the Southwest, where Kansas City became the focal point of a revolution that was to have a deep and lasting effect on the history of jazz. Kansas City's central position in the history of jazz is partly due to the fact that it was not affected by the Depression. Between 1927 and 1938, rather like the Chicago of the 20s, it was run by gangsters and corrupt politicians. The gangsters did well, the town prospered, nightlife flourished, and jazz bands found work. Gangsterdom was not the only reason. Kansas City was a center of communication. It was at the junction of the Missouri and Kansas rivers, and was a port of call for riverboat traffic. It was a meeting point of important roads and an important railway junction. The position of Kansas City encouraged jazz in two ways. The city had grown wealthy because of its position, and the influx of trade and money increased the demand for entertainment. Because many road and rail routes ran through the city, touring musicians and singers stopped there on their way to play in other places. Musical background. Kansas City had always been a center of musical activity with a special atmosphere that made it a musician's town. Before 1920, riverboats from New Orleans had turned west along the Missouri, bringing the hard-hitting New Orleans ensemble style with them. About the same time, the crude rhythmic blues piano style, later known as boogie woogie, had made its way to Kansas City. After the First World War, the migration of Negroes from the Deep South, from Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, to the southwest states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas, more than doubled. The migrants brought the dance rhythms of the Deep South and the blues of the cotton fields and sugar plantations. The Southwest became the last reservoir of cheap Negro labor and of Negro music, and Kansas City became the springboard of the new style of jazz. In the 1920s, dance music became big business in the Southwest. Negro bands toured on regular circuits between Houston, Dallas, and Kansas City. The Negro population of Kansas City supported several large ballrooms. The dancers wanted virile music with an exciting beat. By the late 1920s, in direct response to the needs of a dancing audience, a swinging, powerful style was evolving that solved the problems of big band jazz in a way that was without precedent in the history of jazz. The reshaping of jazz. The musical revolution that took place in Kansas City was built on the jam session, the blues, and the demands of a dancing audience. It grew naturally and gradually out of a zest of ballroom crowds and the technique and ideas of individual musicians. Its most important single musical characteristic was its use of the blues as the foundation of an instrumental style. Jam sessions. The jam session, in which the musicians get together after working hours to play for their own enjoyment, is both cooperative and competitive. It can be a collective experiment in which new ideas are exchanged and tried out. It can be a cutting contest in which musicians try to outplay one another. Kansas City was a musician's town. Its jam sessions were exciting and colorful, and its standards of musicianship high. There were jam sessions at any time of the day or night. Their fame spread far and wide, and every important jazz soloist wanted to play in them. When Hawkins arrived in Kansas City, all the local tenor players would rush to play with him. The resulting cutting contest might last for hours and wear out several rhythm sections. The blues. Many different styles met in Kansas City, and the problem of the jam session was to find a common denominator for these different ways of playing. Many visiting musicians had only a few hours to spare, and to allow them to take part, the tune used as a basis for solo improvisation had to be known by as many players as possible. It had to be simple enough to be played without rehearsal, and it had to allow them to demonstrate to the full their technique and ideas. One source of material was the popular song, but the basis of the jam session was the blues. All the musicians knew the blues, and now they treated them as a foundation on which to build solos of great technical virtuosity. The blues were made the basis of fast and slow numbers, of ensemble playing and solos, and there was not a tempo or a mood to which the blues were not fitted. Riffs. The use of the blues form led to the building of new melodic figures as foundations for the soloists. The Kansas City process was one of simplification. The New Orleans improvised ensemble style was pared down to a succession of simple phrases played in unison. Short, simple melodic phrases, known as riffs, were repeated throughout the 12 bars of the blues. High standards of musicianship produced virtuoso soloists, and the jam session became a string of solos between two short ensemble passages of riffs played at the beginning and end of the performance. The ensemble riff became a point of departure for the soloist, before he played several solo choruses of the blues. In this way, the jam session and its use of riffs placed greater emphasis than ever before on the individual soloist. Riffs were played as an ensemble statement, as a background to solos, as a part of the call and response pattern of the blues. Kansas City musicians raised the riff to a fine, even an improvised art. The leaders of sections would invent riffs on the spur of the moment, and the entire section would play them. Riffs would build back and forth between sections, chorus after chorus, from the simple to the complex to a final swinging climax. A performance built up in this way on the bandstand was called a head arrangement. The powerful swinging attack of the players created a rhythmic drive and excitement eminently suited to the needs of the dancers who crowded the ballrooms. The blues had become not only the common denominator of the jam session, but also, because they were as familiar to the dancers as to the musicians, the most important single component of a new style of big band jazz. Swing. This new way of playing was grafted onto the rhythmic pulse developed in the dance halls of the Southwest. The new rhythm had 4 even beats to a bar, subtler, smoother, and more flowing than anything that had gone before. It brought relaxation to jazz without losing the drive and intensity of New Orleans ensemble style. It was one of the most distinctive features of Kansas City music, and a rhythm section or a soloist who played in this way was said to swing. Blues singers. A new form of blues singing, closely linked to the instrumental style, developed in Kansas City. Blues singers like Jimmy Rushing and Joe Turner attacked the blues in the same bold way as the musicians. They were more Catholic in outlook than earlier blues singers, and their blues expressed excitement as well as sorrow. Although they retained the intensity and feeling of the blues, their driving, volatile style of singing was closer to an instrumental solo than that of earlier singers, and in Kansas City, they became an integral part of the jazz band. Benny Moten. The evolution of Kansas City jazz can be traced in the career of Benny Moten. As early as 1922, he was leading a 6-piece band that played a New Orleans ensemble type of jazz. By the late 1920s, the band had developed a smoother but still driving style, with a 4-beat rhythm and a pronounced feeling for the blues. By 1930, the transition was complete. His band of 5 brass, 4 saxes, and 4 rhythm was swinging, relaxed, and powerful. Other bands in the Southwest were playing a similar kind of jazz, but the most significant stage in the development of Kansas City style was reached after Moten's death, when Count Basie reformed the band in 1935. Instrumental blues style. Kansas City style was a flexible framework for big band jazz that was to be more widely adopted than the Ellington or Redmond techniques. It was a combination of ensemble riffs played with great precision and power, a relaxed, swinging 4-beat rhythm, and solo improvisations on the blues. It forged a link between the blues and big band jazz. The blues singer was used as part of the band, and in the Southwest, the words blues and jazz were inseparable. It was created by and designed for musicians who had realized the full possibilities of their instruments and had mastered the art of swinging, and it demanded and encouraged tremendous technical virtuosity and a swinging attack. Kansas City occupies a central position chronologically and stylistically in the history of jazz. The music played there looks back to the early blues and forward to the swing era and the evolution of bop. It forms a direct link between the unknown blues singer of the Deep South and the brilliant instrumental creations of modern jazz musicians. After the Depression, jazz, in a less diluted form than in the 1920s, once again became the commercial, popular music of America. Pop music adopted almost completely the instrumental techniques and big band arrangements worked out by the Negro musicians of the 1920s, and later assimilated the style that had evolved in Kansas City. The commercial success of swing was overwhelming, and it contained within it the reasons for its end and the seeds of 2 further developments. Swing. Although swing was sold with all the tactics of high-pressure salesmanship as a new music, it was only another more fashionable name for the big band music developed almost 10 years before. Once again, an original Negro jazz style, developed in the clubs and ballrooms of Harlem, was absorbed and diluted by commercial popular music. The white swing bands copied the style worked out by Redman and Henderson, but as swing became a saleable product, they relied more and more on an insistent rhythm, considerable noise, showy arrangements, screeching high notes, and endless drum solos. The progress of swing was shaped by the demands of an adulatory teenage audience. Whether they danced or listened, the teenagers' reactions were as frenzied as those of religious converts during the Great Awakening. Their style of dancing, known as jiving or jitterbugging, was athletic and acrobatic, and they stormed concert halls and theaters to dance the Big Apple and the Shag in the aisles. They crowded round the bandstand to listen to the music, tapping their feet, snapping their fingers, twitching their bodies, and yelling and swooning with delight. They referred to themselves as alligators and hep cats, and to their musician idols as killer dillers and solid senders. The king of swing. Clarinetist Benny Goodman was the god of hordes of young worshippers. In 1935, he was swept to national fame and prosperity on the crest of a jitterbug wave, and it was easy for publicity agents and newspapers to christen him the King of Swing. The deepest influence on his music was that of Fletcher Henderson. Henderson arranged for the band, and by late 1934, Goodman had 36 Henderson arrangements as the basis of his repertoire. His precise, well-disciplined way of playing them produced a clean, swinging music that, to the general public, sounded new and exciting. Goodman had proved that jazz, hot and swinging, could be a commercial proposition, especially when played by white bands. His success produced a host of imitators, and for the next 10 years, countless bands made good money in a mad whirl of concerts, dances, radio shows, and record sessions. Negro bands. The white swing bands had followed the lead of the Negro musicians. Their commercial success paved the way for that of the Negro bands. Bands, such as those led by Ellington, Chick Webb, Jimmy Lunsford, and Teddy Hill, were popular and prosperous during the swing era. At the same time, there was a more general recognition of individual Negro musicians. Armstrong and Fats Waller were nationally famous entertainers, and Goodman, by employing Negro musicians, helped to break the color prejudice in jazz. But although white and Negro interests often influenced and merged with each other, they were still largely separate, and the white bands still commanded higher pay. In general, the Negro supplied the musical fire and originality, and the white band leaders the presentation and box office packaging. Count Basie. In the late 30s, the most active influence on jazz came from Kansas City in the shape of the Count Basie Band's arrangements and soloists. The Basie Band brought to New York the music that had been developed in the ballrooms and jam sessions of Kansas City. And by continuing to build its repertoire on the blues, and to play head arrangements with ferocity and relaxation, it brought a new sense of freedom and power to big band jazz. Goodman began to exploit Basie tunes, to copy Kansas City riffs, and to use Basie musicians on record sessions. The popular swing bands failed to match the freshness, power, and relaxation of the Basie Band, but, by rigorous drill and mechanical riffing, they achieved a saleable imitation of its head arrangements. Once again, a music born out of the needs of musicians and ballroom crowds became a marketable mannerism to be exploited by managers, agents, and publicity men. The lusty driving power of the Basie Band was shaped and controlled by the spare and sober piano playing of its leader. Basie was part of a rhythm section that had left Kansas City as a unit, and remained a perfectly integrated team until the late 40s. It concentrated on providing a powerful, compelling beat, allied to a phenomenal lightness and relaxation. Bass player Walter Page and guitarist Freddie Green laid down a steady, unflagging beat that filled in the frequent gaps left by Basie's sparse piano, and allowed drummer Joe Jones freedom to create fluid, supple, rhythmic patterns. The result was a revolution in jazz rhythm that influenced the swing era and planted the seeds of later developments. Sidemen. The soloists in the big swing bands, called sidemen because they sat at either side of their leader, became stars in their own right. Many musicians in a swing band were anonymous, though essential members of well-rehearsed sections, but the soloists became as famous as their leaders. Building on the foundations laid by earlier jazzmen, they made vast technical strides, and the end of the 30s saw the growth of new styles and the development of original stylists. The rhythm section. The great swing drummers, Cozy Cole, Chick Webb, and Big Sid Catlett, developed a subtle, dynamic style, but it was Joe Jones who revolutionized the art of drumming. The hi-hat cymbal became the main carrier of the beat, leaving the drummer free to create rhythmic patterns on bass and snare drums. Drumming became more flexible and expressive, and the rhythmic pulse of jazz gained in relaxation, tension, and subtlety. Charlie Christian, who came from the Southwest to join Goodman, made the guitar a melodic instrument. His dazzling technique, helped by the electrification of the instrument, which gave it more power and volume, dominated Goodman's small group recordings. In his hands, the guitar became a solo instrument, and an important part of the ensemble. In 1939, Jimmy Blanton came from St. Louis to play with Ellington, and until his death in 1942, his harmonic and melodic ideas transformed the place of the bass in jazz. Pops Foster, and later Walter Page, had developed the string bass as a steady pillar of the beat. With the Ellington Band and in duets with Ellington on tunes such as Plucked Again and Pitter Panther Patter, Blanton gave the bass greater rhythmic freedom, and made it a melodic as well as a rhythmic instrument. Piano. Fats Waller, whose boisterous, energetic singing made him a commercial success, was also a powerfully swinging, highly skilled pianist. He developed the Harlem style, and his playing influenced the man who was probably the most brilliant virtuoso pianist in jazz, Art Tatum. Tatum had prodigious technique, and his instrumental command has never been surpassed. His style was characterized by unexpected changes of tempo, breathtaking runs, and ornate decorations. His playing, a combination of technical brilliance and original harmonic experiment, extended the possibilities of solo piano for later pianists. Brass. Roy Eldridge, called Little Jazz by fellow musicians, extended the trumpet's range and agility. His clean, hard, round tone and the structure of his solos on records such as Rockin' Chair reflect the influence of Armstrong. On other records such as Heckler's Hop, his searching style of improvisation and his loose, many-noted solos look forward to later developments. At its best, his playing was lithe and exciting, and he played intricate constructions and cascades of notes with suppleness and authority. J.C. Higginbottom, and more particularly Dickie Wells, who played with Basie, adapted the trombone to the swing era and brought it to its highest point of achievement. Wells was perhaps the greatest trombone stylist in jazz, and his command of the instrument was so complete that he seemed to be able to blow anything he liked on it. Long notes blown with a big tone and fierce vibrato, violent stabbing phrases played with a slashing, spirited attack, notes blown in a low, husky whisper. His solos were audacious and dramatic, humorous and imaginative, but always carefully constructed and played with superb rhythmic ease. Tenor saxophone. Hawkins' direct, aggressive style set the standard for the tenor players of the swing era. He was still the major influence, and Chu Berry, Ben Webster, and every other tenor player were his followers. The exception was Lester Young, who, although he was born in New Orleans, gained his musical experience in the Southwest before joining Basie. From the first, he adopted and persisted in a style of his own that was the exact opposite of Hawkins' excitable, tempestuous playing. He stuck to a soft, smooth, flat tone, and a strictly controlled vibrato, cultivating a restrained approach, lagging behind the beat, and searching for subtle melodic runs, for the devious and the unexpected. Young, like Hawkins, is now accepted as one of the great formative influences of jazz, but in the 30s and 40s his reticent style and light disembodied playing were disparaged by critics and fellow musicians. To listeners used to the full, breathy sound of Hawkins' tenor, Young's playing sounded angular and detached, almost without feeling. He was the first great jazz musician to be consciously opposed to the jazz style of his age, the first to be an artist ahead of his time. The Split. The star sidemen played with different bands and in a variety of settings. Bunny Berrigan, one of the greatest white trumpet players, was a featured soloist with the bands of Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and Glenn Miller. Roy Eldridge played with Teddy Hill and Henderson before becoming a star soloist with the white bands of Gene Krupa and Artie Shaw. Both led their own big bands, both played and recorded with their own small groups, and both played in various radio and recording bands. One of the reasons for their constant movements was a feeling of dissatisfaction with the music they had to play as part of a large commercial band. For the jazz musician, playing in a big swing band meant hard work, good pay, endless rehearsals, and high-level teamwork. To please the public, the bands had to play the same arrangements night after night, and the playing of even the best-intentioned musician became mechanical, and in some cases exhibitionist. The jazz musician did not object to hard work and good pay, but he resented the limitations swing imposed on his technique and ideas, and the awkward, impersonal discipline of a big band. He looked for freedom in small bands of various kinds. He lived in two musical worlds, that of the commercial big band and that of the jam session and pickup group. This had happened before, but now the distinction between playing for money and playing for enjoyment sharpened. The musician played one way to make people applaud, and another for his own interest. One way for money and another for personal satisfaction. This distinction is reflected in the organization of the big bands and in the records made during the swing era. Many of the big bands featured small groups. Goodman's main contribution to jazz was as the leader of several smaller groups that he featured alongside his big band. Many of the finest records of the era were made by small pickup groups, like those led by Lionel Hampton, using the great musicians of the day, playing as they wanted to play away from the limitations of the big band style. Jazz began to develop in two ways, towards a specialized kind of pop music and a music for musicians and a hardcore of specialized jazz fans. Singers. Most swing bands featured one, sometimes two, vocalists. Blues shouter Jimmy Rushing was part of the bassy sound, and his powerful voice swung the whole band along with him. But the blues were only a small part of the repertoire of most jazz singers in the late 30s. Bessie Smith had reached out for a wider audience by singing popular music hall songs, and Billie Holiday, known as Lady Day, extended and developed this new style of jazz singing. With the improvisational freedom of a soloist, she molded the popular songs of the day to suit her own purposes. Accompanied by small groups like those led by pianist Teddy Wilson, the poignant, biting quality of her voice, balanced precariously between tenderness and pain, gave a highly personal meaning to the pop songs of the swing era. Ella Fitzgerald, who sings rather like a musician might play, started her career in 1934 when at the age of 16 she began to record with the Chick Webb Band. Her fresh swinging approach and lately her astonishing air of nonchalance have made her the most popular singer of the present day. End of the swing era. Around 1945, the big band boom came to an end. Traveling restrictions imposed because of the Second World War, attacks on dance floors, a record ban, and the use of the microphone made it easier and more profitable to book singers as solo attractions. Frank Sinatra and other singers were to become the idols of a new generation of teenagers known as Bobby Soxers. But because swing had become a standardized and repetitive formula, it had worn itself out. Small band jazz rebelled against the standardization of the commercial success of swing. It developed in two opposite directions. By 1945, these two extreme movements, the New Orleans Revival and bop, had begun to crush interest in the big band and solo styles of the swing era, and to break up the standards established during the two previous decades. The swing era split the development of jazz. Swing had become a successful commercial formula. Its jazz content had been diluted by a host of imitators, and it had become mechanical and repetitive. In the early 40s, jazz musicians and a specialized jazz audience rebelled against swing. The first reaction against swing was the New Orleans Revival. The revival was an illogical extremist movement imposed by a specialized audience of record collectors and critics who, in their search for authentic, non-commercial jazz, turned away from swing and looked back to earlier forms of jazz. Although the revival was based on early Negro jazz, it was primarily a white movement. It added nothing new musically, but it awakened interest in the beginnings of jazz, and it made one kind of jazz an international language. Swing Street. The success of the big swing bands created work for the many small improvising bands that played on New York's 52nd Street and gave it the name of Swing Street. Some musicians who couldn't or wouldn't read music never played in big bands. To Wingy Manone, a white trumpeter from New Orleans who had only one arm, 5 flats looked like a bunch of grapes. But his playing on Swing Street in 1935 helped to make it the home of an astonishing variety of small bands. Negro musicians such as trumpeter Frankie Newton, violinist Stuff Smith, and bass player John Kirby led bands in the clubs of 52nd Street. Singers like Billie Holiday and pianists like Art Tatum worked there. Big band soloists like Berrigan and Eldridge moved between the two worlds of big band swing and the small groups and after-hours jam sessions of Swing Street. The Barefoot Mob. In the late 20s and early 30s, the white musicians from Chicago settled in New York. Some played in big bands, others became a permanent part of the small band scene. Eddie Condon, rhythm guitarist and banjoist, did much to keep Chicago music and musicians alive. When his Barefoot Mob, as he christened them, found it difficult to get work, he organized public jam sessions. Sometimes as many as 30 musicians took part, and the inevitable mixture of styles led to the development of a particular way of playing. The repertoire of Condon's jam sessions was unchanging, ensemble playing was formalized, and the emphasis was on solos. Although it was basically a white personnel, Bechet, J.C. Higginbottom, trumpeter Hot Lips Page, and other colored musicians played, and the color bar in jazz was breached more lastingly and effectively in Condon's jam sessions than anywhere else. The style of playing, influenced by the white styles of New Orleans, Chicago, and New York, was given the label of Dixieland. During the 30s, Condon's unceasing efforts on behalf of the mob resulted in a wave of enthusiasm that gave them a large and faithful following. Public jam sessions created a demand for records, and McPartlin, Freeman, Pee Wee Russell, Wild Bill Davison, Condon himself, and many others recorded. The Condon type of small band jazz became popular. The Bob Crosby Bobcats, a small group from within a big band, made Dixieland-style records in 1937. In 1939, cornet player Muggsy Spanier made 16 sides with his 8-piece ragtime band. They were an indication of things to come. The growing interest in Dixieland style paved the way for a revival of interest in New Orleans jazz. But though Condon and Spanier, by keeping Dixieland alive, had helped to make the revival possible, they were not to be a part of it. An art form. The revival did not grow out of the demands of musicians, nor those of pop music. It was imposed almost wholly by a handful of white intellectuals, critics, and record collectors. It was a rebellion against commercialism and against contemporary musicians, and it became a purist cult with its own doctrines. Jazz became an art form to be studied, analyzed, and discussed. The doctrinaires of the revival claimed that jazz had reached a final and definitive form in New Orleans, and that later developments were commercial dilutions of a pure tradition. Existing forms of jazz were dismissed as later, weaker styles, and only the traditional jazz of New Orleans was accepted as genuine and unspoiled art. By 1938, record collectors and critics had begun to record forgotten jazzmen in attempts to recreate early New Orleans jazz. Restoration of old players. Jelly Roll Morton was discovered in Washington in 1938. He was playing piano in an obscure bar known successively as the Jungle Club, the Music Box, and the Blue Moon. Bitter and disappointed, he claimed that he had invented jazz and that other musicians were making money out of his ideas. Although he died in 1941, his music and his recollections of New Orleans focused attention on the beginnings of jazz. Trombonist Kid Ory, born 1889, had led his own band in Storyville and played with Morton, Oliver, and Armstrong in Chicago. He retired in 1929. He was discovered in 1940, and in 1942, with a band that contained such New Orleans veterans as Mutt Carey, he began a second, more lucrative career. Sidney Bechet, born 1891, had played in New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. He had toured Europe, and billed as the talking saxophone. He had traveled as far as Russia. Although he had broken away from the New Orleans style, he was revered, particularly in Europe, as a living example of traditional jazz. Ory and Bechet were key figures of the revival. Bunk Johnson, born 1879, became the symbol of New Orleans jazz, a living legend. He had played with Bolden before 1900 and then disappeared for almost 40 years. He was discovered in 1938 working as a truck driver in the rice fields of Louisiana. Several record collectors contributed to buy him a trumpet and a new set of false teeth, and he declared that at the age of 64 he was ready to begin a second career. Before his death in 1949, he made many records of variable quality. Many of them sound rough and uninspired, but the best illustrate his short-phrased, choppy style of playing and the exhilarating, cheerful sound of New Orleans jazz. The White Revivalists. Although the revival included New Orleans veterans and was based entirely on early Negro jazz, the music was played largely by young white musicians for white audiences outside New Orleans. As early as 1939, Lou Waters and his Yerba Buena Jazz Band in San Francisco had begun a painstaking reconstruction of New Orleans style by deliberately copying the records of King Oliver's Creole Orchestra. In the early 40s, amateur jazz bands sprang up all over America. They copied old records as carefully as they could. Their music was more energetic than skillful, characterized by stolid, unswinging rhythm sections, the clank of a banjo, bad intonation, and a complete lack of originality. But traditional jazz was cheerful, and it was easily enjoyed and easy to play. The followers of traditional jazz, or moldy figs as they called themselves, were very often fanatical and rather naive purists. They acted as though they were selling some kind of gospel and tried to impose an absurdly extreme set of values on jazz. Jazz had to conform to a rigid set of rules. Armstrong, for example, had played jazz until 1927. After that, he had gone commercial. Bechet, who played soprano saxophone and came from New Orleans, was in. Hawkins, who played tenor and came from Missouri, was out. Waters, who led a small band, was acceptable. Ellington, who led a big one, was not. Condon and Spanier, who had been copying New Orleans style about 20 years before, were relatively modern and did not therefore play authentic jazz. Dozens of young men who had never seen New Orleans and who could hardly play their instruments played authentic New Orleans jazz. Influence. In spite of its naive approach, absurd misconceptions, and lack of musical originality, the revival had an important historical or archaeological value, and it made one kind of jazz an international music. New light was thrown on the beginnings of jazz. Folk artists and blues singers like Leadbelly and Big Bill Broonzy were recorded. Religious singers like Mahalia Jackson and Sister Rosetta Tharpe reached a wider audience. The roots of jazz were unearthed, and many singers and musicians who might never have been heard were discovered and recorded. Traditional bands sprang up outside America, in Holland, France, Japan, Australia, and many other countries. In England, pianist George Webb led a band that was influenced at first by the ODJB and the Chicagoans, and later by the music of Oliver and Morton. In 1948, trumpeter Humphrey Lyttelton left the Webb band to form what was to become one of the most successful musicianly and imaginative of British jazz bands. Before long, like other jazz styles, traditional jazz was to become pop music. Consequently, it was to lose its appeal as a minority art form and as a music of protest against commercialism and conformity. No young Negro musicians took part in the New Orleans revival. They had their own extremist movement, a new jazz style that was given the name of bop. Like the revival, bop was a rebellion against the swing era. But bop was a movement of Negro musicians, not white critics. It looked forward, not back. It made an original contribution to the development of jazz, and it was a logical, if over-hasty, extension of earlier jazz styles. Minton's Playhouse. The early bop musicians came from swing bands. They were bored and frustrated with the increasingly standardized and repetitive arrangements they had to play, and they revolted not by looking back to New Orleans, but by forging new methods of expression. The new style was developed at a series of long, informal sessions at a small club in Harlem called Minton's Playhouse. After 1941, it was managed by Teddy Hill, a former swing band leader. He hired a band that included drummer Kenny Clark and pianist Thelonious Monk. Charlie Christian, until his death in 1942, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker were on hand for after-hours experiments. Together, and in varying combinations, they began working out new harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic variations. Bop. At first, their way of playing had no name. Then it was called rebop, bebop, and finally, bop. The musicians said the word was an imitation of a typical sound of the new music. Bop broke away from earlier forms of jazz expression and seemed deliberately complicated and confusing. It extended the harmonies of jazz and used unusual and complicated chord progressions as the basis of composition and improvisation. The use of new harmonies led to the writing of new tunes and to the reshaping of old jazz material. The melody was based very often on the harmonies of the popular song or the blues, but nobody played the tune. The musicians built a new theme out of the harmonies of the original tune, often changing or elaborating them as they did so. They no longer improvised on a simple theme, but on the melody and harmonies of a theme that was never stated. A competent musician was expected to know, without being told, that Groovin' High, for example, was based on the tune and chords of whispering. Conventional jazz themes were rejected, and so was the accepted style of jazz singing. The new musicians invented their own style and their own words, such as those sung by Gillespie in Oop-Pop-Ba-Da. Oop-Pop-Ba-Da. Blee-a-ba-doo-la, bee-blee-bop. Bop rhythm was equally confusing. It did not indicate the beat. It disguised it. The drummer's top cymbal provided a light, flexible pulse, a rhythmic shiver that left him free to create irregular added accents on the rest of his kit. The pianist played less in the left hand and concentrated on short, jabbing phrases and intricate runs in the right. Only the bass played 4 regular beats to a bar. Bop made jazz rhythm more fragmentary, more subtle, more flowing. Bop rhythm became even more complicated when Gillespie hired Chano Pozo, an African-Cuban drummer who had mastered the rhythms of West African music that still survived in Havana. Pozo was killed in mysterious circumstances in a bar in Harlem, but before his death he had influenced modern jazz drummers, and they had adopted some of his complex rhythms. In many ways, bop was a test of musical expertise. It was also a test of technical virtuosity. Gillespie and Parker and trombonist J.J. Johnson played with unheard-of speed and brilliance. Kenny Clark tried to make the drums more musical, making them play tunes as well as rhythms. Pianist Bud Powell played with tremendous swing, phenomenal technique, and a long flow of ideas at seemingly impossible speeds. Monk, Diz, and Bird. The three major figures of bop were pianist Thelonious Monk, trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, and alto saxophonist Charlie Parker. Thelonious Sphere Monk, known as the Monk or the High Priest of Bop, used its harmonic complexity to create a new jazz repertoire. Round About Midnight, Off Minor, Well You Needn't, and other new tunes use challenging harmonies and unusual modulations, and though they have become jazz standards, they were referred to at the time as zombie music. John Burks Gillespie was known as Diz or Dizzy because of his mad ideas. At first, many of his contemporaries thought he played wrong notes, but eventually they were compelled to admire his advanced harmonic ideas, dazzling technical facility, complex melodic line, and impeccable sense of timing. Monk and Gillespie became the public symbols of bop, but the acknowledged genius of the movement was Charlie Parker, known as Yardbird, after a character in a comic strip, and later as Bird. Born in 1920, he was brought up in the slums of Kansas City. He learned to play saxophone while still at school, and by the time he was 16, he was playing in the town's best bands. In the early 40s, he went to New York, where he took part in the sessions at Minton's. An incredible virtuoso with an astonishing instrumental technique, Parker seemed to be able to play whatever he wanted with superb ease. Records such as Parker's Mood, Now's the Time, Coco, and Scrapple from the Apple showed the incredible variety of his playing. On some, he plays with a bursting enthusiasm, using a deluge of notes. On others, his phrasing is simple and direct. Sometimes his ideas sound angular and tormented. At others, he plays long, swinging, bounding, melodic lines. Sometimes he stresses the beat. At others, he violently accents the weak beat, or places his accents between the regular beats of the bar. At times, he played with a harsh, strident tone and a fierce, aggressive attack. At others, his playing was elegant, oblique, and lyrical. The diversity of his playing was so great that it has become usual to speak of his hot and cool styles of playing. A social protest. Other jazz styles had evolved gradually as a result of the demands of musicians, audiences, or pop music. Bop seemed radically different because it emerged with almost frightening suddenness. It was imposed by a small group of musicians playing a deliberately complicated music, and it was a social as well as a musical protest. The extreme social pressures that were brought to bear on the Negroes from the beginnings of the 40s had made the bop musician socially and individually different from his predecessors. He lived in a time of war, a white man's war, with its attendant tension and uncertainty. He suffered from augmented racial persecution and was the object of several riots. At the same time, as a soldier or a worker in a wartime job, he was asked to fight for freedom. Added to this was a rootlessness and upheaval in values caused by another mass migration from the South to the North. This environment gave rise to a desperate bitterness and a heightened racial awareness. The bop musicians wanted to wipe out the memory of a past in which the Negro had been treated as an inferior being, and his music had been copied and exploited. For this reason, they had no interest in the revival, and they tried to make their music different and difficult so that it couldn't be copied. It was for this reason, too, that they revolted against the behavior of earlier jazzmen. They refused to entertain a white public in the same way as earlier jazzmen like Armstrong and Waller. They wanted to be judged as serious musicians, not as popular entertainers. But they went too far. They played the most revolutionary jazz with an air of complete boredom, turned their back on their audiences, and shuffled on and off stage at the beginning and end of their solos. Wild-eyed revolutionaries. The pioneers of bop were dedicated to their way of playing and openly hostile to earlier forms of jazz, which they dismissed as sticky, and earlier musicians whom they condemned as squares. Bop threatened the position of the older jazzmen. They found themselves sounding old-fashioned, and the standards they had established openly condemned. They defended themselves by bitterly attacking the new music, and by refusing to accept the bop musicians, whom they referred to as dirty radicals and wild-eyed revolutionaries. By demanding attention for bop as serious music, the revolutionaries were competing in a white world in which, as Negroes, they were not accepted. By turning their backs on earlier forms of jazz and earlier jazz musicians, they had cut themselves off from their Negro past. They had to struggle to achieve status and recognition, and, in the early days of bop, many went without jobs and meals rather than play music that outraged their convictions. They were social misfits accepted by neither white nor Negro, and the pressure of being deliberately revolutionary resulted in feelings of rootlessness and inadequacy. Bop became an escape from the harsh reality of the American environment, and the musicians were determined to be different by refusing to conform to accepted standards of behavior. Monk and Gillespie originated a bop uniform of goatee, beret, heavily rimmed glasses, and baggy crumpled suits. They invented a bop language which contained such phrases as "Uliaku," and in which the terms of approval were "gone," "cool," and "bells man." Some, like Kenny Clark, who for a time called himself Liaquat Ali Salam, set themselves apart from the American way of life by becoming members of the Mohammedan faith. Others sought relief from tension in psychoanalysis and drugs. A few, like Bud Powell, suffered from repeated collapses, never worked for long, and lived in a state of perpetual anguish. Gillespie was saved by his outright sense of humor. Monk withdrew into eccentricity, eating only when he felt hungry and sleeping only when he felt tired, occasionally pretending that he was a native of Damascus and acquiring a reputation of being difficult to work with. Gillespie wore the mask of a clown. Monk became an enigma. Charlie Parker had no protection and no escape but death. He died in 1955 at the age of 34. Like Armstrong, he had been brought up in the slums of a city. Like Armstrong, he was far ahead of his time, and his ideas dominated and influenced the jazz of his day. Armstrong triumphed over his environment. Parker was unable to do this. Earlier in his career, he had a nervous breakdown. Later, he became a drug addict. Armstrong accepted his past. Parker cut himself off from his past and from the world. He was a displaced person, an outcast, unable to come to terms with society. There is a sense of helplessness about his shattered life, and something hopelessly inevitable about his death. The hipster. The follower of bop called himself a hipster because he was hip, informed, in the know. Like the white critics who had caused the revival, he was savagely intolerant. The traditionalists said that bop was not jazz. The hipster replied that traditional jazz was corny and outdated. Both dismissed the jazz of the swing era, one as commercial and old-fashioned, the other as commercial and modern. And between them they crushed interest in the music of the swing musicians. For a time, jazz was split into different, bitterly feuding groups. Tradition. Although at first it sounded chaotic and meaningless, bop was based very firmly on the traditional elements of jazz. It was a logical, though somewhat bewildering continuation and complication of earlier styles. Bop was an extreme reaction against the swing era, but it was also an extension of it. Bop musicians came from swing bands, and they built on the innovations of the great swing musicians. Gillespie's style, for example, can be traced back to that of Eldridge, and so to that of Armstrong. Until 1941, Parker played in the lusty, swinging, blues-playing Kansas City band led by pianist Jay McShann. He claimed that bop is what I brought from Kansas City, and in many ways bop was a continuation of Kansas City style. It was developed at jam sessions. It adopted the framework of a unison statement of a theme followed by solos and a final unison statement. It used the popular song and the blues, however changed they may have been, as a foundation for solos of great technical virtuosity. Bop rhythm was directly influenced by the bassy rhythm section. Kenny Clark was influenced by and built on the work of Joe Jones, and the regular beat of the bass and the lack of emphasis on the pianist's left hand had been foreshadowed by Walter Page and Basie. In some ways, bop looked back to the very beginnings of jazz. Bop soloists were improvisers in the old hot or dirty tradition. Gillespie's statement, "If you can't sing it, you can't play it," echoes Mutt Carey's explanation of the beginnings of jazz tone and improvisation. Parker was almost wholly a blues player. He said that the blues were the basis of jazz, and his hot style is reminiscent of the work of early blues and religious singers. Bop rhythm, in its complexity and polyrhythmic effects, was the most African of all jazz rhythms, and in the case of Chano Pozo, looked back to the prehistory of jazz. Assimilation. The first stage of bop had been its most extreme. By 1950 it no longer sounded revolutionary. After the first savage bitterness, many of the older musicians, notably Coleman Hawkins, adopted elements of bop style into their playing, and bop musicians ceased to be quite so dogmatic and revolutionary. Gillespie's small groups, for example, played an exciting, swinging jazz with the emphasis firmly on the beat. And when Monk recorded with Hawkins, he said that he himself sounded just like James P. Johnson. The early 50s were dominated by two extreme movements that extended the two-way development of jazz begun in the swing era, and showed the effects of European influence. There was a move to refine jazz, and to make it a respectable art form by incorporating European classical practices. And once again, in Age of Prosperity, Negro musical characteristics were absorbed and diluted by commercial popular music. But jazz was beginning to return to a central position somewhere between these two extremes, and the late 50s were years of fusion, not fission, in the history of jazz. Cool jazz. The hipster had popularized the use of the word cool, and in the early 50s it was used to describe a way of playing jazz that was derived partly from bop and partly from earlier styles. Young musicians admired and copied the cool element in Parker's playing, but the influence of Lester Young, who had played with Basie in the 30s, was even greater than that of Parker. In the 50s, his influence was so great that he was referred to as Prez, short for the President, by the younger musicians who copied him. Miles Davis. The cool style can be said to have begun in 1949 when Negro trumpeter Miles Davis was asked to lead two 9-piece recording groups. The Negro musicians in the groups had played with Gillespie and Parker. The white musicians came from the Claude Thornhill Big Band. Their records, with titles such as Budo, Godchild, Israel, and Boplicity, opened up new directions in jazz. The cool style was set by the arrangers, Gil Evans, Jerry Mulligan, John Lewis, and John Carisi, who used French horn and tuba as well as the more conventional jazz instruments to create a pure mellow jazz that was referred to at the time as a new sound. The soloists also strove for musical purity. They rejected the old hot or dirty way of playing and tried to make their instruments sound like orthodox classical instruments. The result was a classically influenced chamber music, restrained and relaxed, that could be arranged and played like European art music. The white influence. The influence of the Miles Davis records was far-reaching. The big bands of Woody Herman and Stan Kenton copied the cool sounds of the Davis groups and provided work for several young musicians, some of whom became leaders of the white cool movement. Alto player Lee Konitz, who had recorded with the Davis Band, played for a time with Kenton, and one record by the Herman Band, Early Autumn, made tenor player Stan Getz famous overnight. Getz was a follower of Lester Young and cultivated a thin, wispy tone and an air of exaggerated relaxation. Konitz was a fervent admirer of Parker's cool style. Both were typical of white cool musicians. They concentrated on producing a light, dry, pure sound. They played easily recognizable tunes, and their improvisations stayed close to the melody and close to the beat. The West Coast. Davis, Getz, and Konitz played in New York. In the early 50s, a large number of white musicians, many of whom had played with Herman and Kenton, settled on the West Coast in California. They made a living by working in film studios, radio, and television. They were trained and accomplished musicians, and the cool style appealed to them because it was close to European sound and European forms. They experimented in classical forms and used such classical instruments as flute, French horn, and oboe. Jerry Mulligan, pianist, baritone sax player, and arranger, came from New York to settle on the West Coast. In 1952, he formed a quartet using baritone sax, trumpet, drums, and bass. His use of arranged counterpoint sounded modern. The combination of baritone sax and trumpet, and the absence of a piano, created another new sound. But at the same time, his music was easy to listen to. The quartet played quietly, on the beat, and close to the melody. The music was polite and polished, very similar to that of the Red Nichols groups of the 20s. Records such as My Funny Valentine were bestsellers, and the quartet became a great commercial success. Mulligan's success opened the way for other West Coast musicians who flooded the market with records. Their success, in its turn, opened the way for Negro musicians like Davis, J.J. Johnson, and John Lewis. Of all the musicians based on the West Coast, the one who most obviously made a commercial success of his music was pianist Dave Brubeck. He had studied under Darius Milhaud, a pioneer of modern classical symphony, taken an M.A. in music, and taught at the University of California. At times his quartet seemed to play classical chamber music, featuring the improvised counterpoint of Brubeck and alto player Paul Desmond. fugal ideas, and echoes of classical composers. But Brubeck insists on improvisation at every performance, and he can play in a direct, swinging manner. Like other white musicians of the 50s, he was proud of his jazz heritage and took himself and his music very seriously. Nearly all the West Coast musicians seem to have been too serious. Their music, sometimes restrained, pleasant, and easy to listen to, sometimes ingenious and experimental, often sounded earnest and self-conscious. Like the music of the white musicians of the 20s, their experiments seem to have led into blind alleys. The modern jazz quartet. The Negro intellectuals who were attracted by cool jazz also took themselves very seriously. John Lewis studied music and anthropology at the University of Mexico. He composed and arranged for the Gillespie Big Band and the Miles Davis 1949 session. In 1952, he made his first records with the Modern Jazz Quartet. The quartet uses piano, vibraharp, bass, and drums. Although all its members had played with Gillespie, their music replaced the fervor of bop with the fragility of cool jazz. The quartet is a restrained, intimate ensemble that played the quietest and most meticulous jazz yet heard. Kenny Clarke's drumming and Milt Jackson's vibes gave its early records their basic jazz sound. As musical director, Lewis changed the quartet's policy. By adopting many of the devices of classical composition, he has tried to make jazz intellectual and formalized. This limits the freedom of the soloists, and the quartet has gradually moved away from jazz and now plays a sort of jazz-influenced chamber music. The quartet does not play for dancing. It plays in concert halls to hushed and respectful audiences, and the dress and demeanor of the musicians are copied from classical concerts. This concert hall manner and Lewis's earnest, unbending approach and preoccupation with European forms and techniques is part of a search for musical refinement and social respectability. His avowed sources of inspiration for Fontessa, The Queen's Fancy, and Concord were the Italian Renaissance Commedia dell'arte, the work of Giles Farnaby and other composers of the time of Elizabeth I, and the music of Bach. As the borrowings from Bach and other composers have become more pointless and irrelevant, the quartet's music has become more pretentious, self-conscious, and commercially successful. Commercial jazz, rock and roll. The modern jazz quartet still plays some tunes based on the 12-bar blues. In the 50s, a version of the blues became the commercial popular music of the Western world. As in the Jazz Age and the Swing era, jazz became the basis of pop music. During the 20s and 30s, Bessie Smith and other blues singers had made race records for the Negro public. In the 40s, the Negro market expanded. In 1950, the word race was dropped, and the records were known as rhythm and blues, usually shortened to R&B. Much R&B was characterized by a rocking beat and a hoarse, sometimes out of tune, sometimes stickily sentimental vocal. Although a great deal of it was of little importance, it provided a market for singers of country blues like Big Bill Broonzy, Muddy Waters, and Lightning Hopkins. And Joe Turner, who had sung in Kansas City in the 30s, was one of the most consistent R&B artists and made many hit records, including Shake, Rattle, and Roll. In 1955, R&B began to be popular with white audiences. White singers copied and simplified Negro records. Rock and roll, as the white version was called, quickly captured a teenage audience to become the pop music of the 50s. Bill Haley and Elvis Presley were idolized by hordes of screaming young worshippers, and the frenzy and foolishness of the swing era were repeated. Rock and roll was popular because it was simple, and it was dance music. It reduced the musical appeal of the blues to its simplest elements, a violent beat and a shouting voice. It was a tasteless version of the real thing, but many white youngsters heard the blues for the first time, and some found their way to jazz through a Count Basie record that featured Joe Williams singing a blues called Every Day. Skiffle. In Britain, rock and roll existed side by side with a homemade type of R&B called skiffle that had grown out of the New Orleans revival. The first skiffle singers were members of traditional jazz bands who sang an occasional song to give the band a rest. At first, the repertoire of skiffle was borrowed from the blues and Negro folk music. Many of Lonnie Donegan's hits were copied from Leadbelly. Rock Island Line, made when he was still a member of Chris Barber's band, was originally a Negro prison song recorded by Leadbelly in the 40s. Skiffle extended its repertoire to include folk songs from other countries, and it gradually became part of a more specialized interest in folk music. While it lasted, skiffle was as much a movement for amateur music making as for listening. A network of skiffle groups sprang up, singing and playing guitars, tea-chest basses, and other homemade instruments in the best traditions of the New Orleans spasm bands. It was a simple, shouting, thumping, rough and ready music, a modification of traditional jazz to suit a less knowledgeable, less demanding public. Trad. During the revival, jazz had become an international music. The popularity of rock and roll and skiffle helped to prepare the way for the acceptance of jazz by a less knowledgeable audience. In America, after the hysteria of the revival had died down, the bands of George Lewis, who had played with Bunk Johnson, and Turk Murphy, who had played with Lou Waters, continued to be popular. In Britain, the revival had largely an amateur movement kept alive by a dedicated minority following. By the early 50s, however, the bands of Humphrey Lyttelton, Ken Collier, and Chris Barber had begun to reach a wider public and to build up a large and loyal following for traditional jazz. By the late 50s, Acker Bilk, who had played with Collier, had made traditional jazz a successful commercial formula. His band plays a simple, cheerful type of jazz, and helped by a high-powered publicity campaign which includes wearing bowler hats and fancy Edwardian waistcoats, it has become immensely popular. Many other bands have followed Bilk's example, and the old-fashioned instrumental jazz of the revival has become popular dance music. Trad, as it is now called, is no longer a dedicated cause, but another fashion in pop music that appeals largely to a teenage audience. Although the popularity of Chris Barber, Acker Bilk, Kenny Ball, and numerous other bands may not have added anything to the development of jazz, it has shown that jazz can still be a cheerful music that can be danced to and enjoyed by a great number of people. It has also made it easier for jazz bands of varying styles to find work, and it has introduced certain characteristics of jazz to a very wide audience. Like other fashions in pop music, the trad success formula imposes certain limitations on the jazzman's technique and ideas. Some British musicians, because they have explored the possibilities of traditional jazz and have become tired of trad cliches, have broken away from the trad formula. Clarinetist Sandy Brown has experimented with West African highlife rhythms, and has also written a number of original themes that blend modern and traditional influences. Humphrey Lyttelton, who in the early 50s led the most influential of the traditional bands, has always been progressive and experimental. He has experimented with Spanish rhythms, and with various combinations of instruments, including a 12-piece band. At the moment, his music is influenced by Armstrong and the jazz of the swing era, particularly of Ellington small recording groups. This type of middle-period jazz has been called mainstream by jazz critics. Mainstream. Lyttelton's change of policy was part of a wider revival of interest in the music and musicians of the 30s. Since the early 40s, the emphasis has been on extremes. In the 50s, there was a reawakening of interest in the music of the 30s because it was thought to hold a central position in the development of jazz. For this reason, it was referred to as the mainstream, or the main stem of jazz. Mainstream jazz became largely a critics' movement, and, as in the case of revival, there has been determined attempts to find and record forgotten musicians and exaggerated claims for their ability. Although many of the musicians who have been rediscovered over the last few years may not be as great as they were, their imagination, swing, musical skill, and warm expressive tone have been appreciated all the more because they have not been heard for a long time. Basie, the blues, and bop. Mainstream is also a return by jazz musicians to basic principles. It can be seen as a reaction against the extreme positions taken up by the followers of the revival and bop, and against the crude impact of rock and roll and the over-refined self-consciousness of the cool school. This return to a more central position has been influenced by Basie, the blues, and bop. Over the years, Basie's style has remained fundamentally the same. Instrumental blues played with a relaxed but powerful beat that was easy to dance to. In the 50s, his new big band began to impress musicians and audiences. Basie's influence was reinforced by that of musicians who had worked with him, particularly trumpeter Buck Clayton and trombonist Vic Dickinson. Clayton and Dickinson summed up neatly the characteristics of mainstream jazz. Both are complete professional musicians, reliable and consistent. Both are relaxed, inventive, swinging soloists. In the early 50s, Clayton became the central figure in a series of LP jam session recordings, and Dickinson led a group in a series of recordings that caught the relaxed atmosphere of a jam session. Their records were based on the music of Kansas City and of the Basie Band. Inevitably, they used ex-Basie musicians and men who had played in Kansas City jam sessions, men like Hawkins, blues singer Jimmy Rushing, trombonist Benny Morton, Tenor player Buddy Tate, Joe Jones, Freddie Green, and Walter Page play on records under Clayton's name. But as in Kansas City jam sessions, Clayton and Dickinson featured a variety of musicians and styles. Clayton used musicians like J.C. Higginbottom, who had played in the 20s, alongside younger musicians such as trumpeter Joe Newman and trombonist Irby Green. Dickinson's front line usually contained New Orleans clarinetist Edmund Hall, born 1901, and a young trumpet player from Boston called Ruby Braff. Basie and musicians who had worked with him played a large part in shifting jazz back toward the center, but theirs was not the only influence. The bop musicians had always been firmly based on the jazz tradition. As early as 1951, Gillespie had led small bands that played swinging, extrovert jazz. Later, two drummers who had played in his big band, Max Roach and Art Blakey, led groups that played forceful yet inventive jazz with a beat. The influence of Parker's hot as well as his cool style began to be felt, and even cool musicians like Getz and Konitz began to cultivate a fuller tone and more virile swing. The influences of bop and Basie fused, and jazz returned to the blues and a swinging beat. Rock and roll had directed attention to the blues. Jazz musicians and critics began to look for a music that was emotionally expressive, a music that showed a feeling for the blues. Pianist Horace Silver gave it the name of soul music to emphasize its emotional rather than intellectual appeal. Others called it funky, literally smelly, to emphasize its down-to-earth reality. Country blues singers like Big Bill Broonzy, Muddy Waters, Sonny Terry, and Brownie McGee recorded in the 50s. Jimmy Rushing and Joe Turner made LPs under their own names. Musicians of different styles made recordings of the blues. In 1957, Clayton, Miles Davis, Monk, New Orleans clarinetist George Lewis, and vibes player Milt Jackson from the Modern Jazz Quartet all recorded versions of the blues. In the same year, the blues and a virile swinging beat provided a common framework for musicians of different styles. Roy Eldridge played with Stan Getz on an LP devoted entirely to the blues. Hawkins recorded with a variety of musicians, including Getz, Monk, Gillespie, Billie Holiday, J.J. Johnson, the Count Basie All-Stars, and a rhythm section made up of John Lewis, Percy Heath, and Connie Kay from the Modern Jazz Quartet. Jazz had returned to fundamentals. The extremist movements had made their contributions and been absorbed, and the different strands of jazz development had been collected together. For several years after the swing era, jazz had seemed to be irrevocably split. It had developed toward pop music on the one hand, and towards different claims for jazz as an art form on the other. A return to the blues and to the basic rhythmic pulse of jazz seems to have resulted in a fusion of these different extremes. No other musical form has spread as far as jazz, and at such bewildering speed. It is now an international music, played, listened to, and discussed in virtually every country in the world. There is even a music called Zaz in Russia. Jazz has also changed with startling rapidity. There is a world of difference between Bunk Johnson's Tishomingo blues and the dry, ascetic flugelhorn concertos of Miles Davis. Between a New Orleans marching band playing Nearer My God to Thee at a funeral around the turn of the century, and the Modern Jazz Quartet playing God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen to a British audience at the Royal Festival Hall in 1961. Each new jazz style has grown out of or been directly influenced by earlier developments, and because jazz has evolved so rapidly, its various styles overlap. Musicians who played in Storyville are still active. Many of the great innovators of the 20s and 30s are still playing. Almost every jazz style, from the George Lewis New Orleans Ragtime Band to the music of John Lewis and the MJQ, can be heard today. The future. The future of jazz is uncertain. It always has been. At the moment, jazz seems to have reached a period of consolidation and reassessment. But it is so flexible and so personal that one man, an Armstrong or a Parker, by developing new forms and methods, or by extending the technical and emotional range of his instrument, could alter the course of jazz. No such man has emerged over the last few years, but musicians are continually trying to extend the boundaries of jazz. Bass player and composer Charlie Mingus has recorded what he calls jazz experiments, or experiments in rotary perception. He gives his themes fanciful titles such as Pithecanthropus erectus, an upright fossil ape man, and uses the noises of gongs and whistles. One LP of Mingus contains a track called The Clown, which consists of a poem read against a jazz background. There have been other attempts to combine jazz and poetry, notably in the beatnik atmosphere of San Francisco, though the fashion has spread as far as London's Mermaid Theatre and St. Pancras Town Hall. The band punctuates and extends the meaning of the poem using the call and response pattern, or, as one jazz musician says, in a question and answer sort of relative pitch way. Very often the band improvises in free form, with no prearranged chords, melody, key, or time signature. As early as 1949, pianist Lenny Tristano had experimented with jazz in free form. Intuition was the result of the completely free improvisations of 6 musicians playing together. Recently, alto player Ornette Coleman, in an effort to give the soloist complete freedom, has extended the use of free form. And in Britain, another solo alto player, Joe Harriott, now plays what he calls abstract music. Coleman's music sounds illogical and meaningless, but it may extend the possibilities of improvisation and become part of the normal jazz language, though at the moment there are no signs that this will be the case. Conclusion. Jazz grew out of Negro folk music. According to Armstrong, it is, like all music, still folk music because he ain't never heard no horse sing a song. It has retained some of the characteristics of folk music in a world seemingly designed to destroy them. It has withstood 2 major stylistic revolutions, one dominated by Armstrong in the 20s, and one by Parker in the 40s. It has resisted the twin pressures of pop and art music, and is now firmly established as a separate musical idiom. Jazz is continually changing, expanding, and developing, and no one can say with any certainty what its future development will be. The jazz of the future may be played in free form. It may be played in styles that have ceased to develop. It may develop in entirely unexpected directions. But whatever happens, there is no reason to believe that jazz will cease to exist. It is now too well established to disappear.